Can you end up in the wrong place at the wrong time, purely by chance? Can such a situation lead to a tragic outcome? Or is our fate already written in the heavens, beyond our power to change? When Nancy swapped shifts with a colleague at the restaurant, she didn't know she was signing her own death warrant. And before we get started, be kind enough to support my channel. Subscribe to the channel, like the video, and stay active. It will help a lot. I will be very grateful to you for that. Let's get started. It was 1967 when Eldwin Lovelady and Janet Stupp met at the Clover Drive-In Theater in Fort Worth, Texas. Eldwin, or Eddie as his friends called him, was born in Louisiana. He was an Air Force mechanic and served in Vietnam. Janet grew up in Fort Worth with her 4 sisters. The girl's family was in dire financial straits, and when she was just 14, her mother pushed her to marry a neighbor. Janet dropped out of school and, at 15, gave birth to her first child, Rito. Motherhood was an overwhelming burden for a teenager, so ultimately, her mother raised the girl. Janet dropped out of school, divorced her husband, and got a job. At 18, the young woman went to a drive-in theater where she happened to notice the most handsome man she had ever seen. Eddie and Janet fell madly in love, got married, and moved to Spokane, Washington. On March 4, 1968, the couple welcomed a beautiful little girl, Nancy. Just 14 months after her birth, she gained a younger brother, Eddie, named after his father. Raising 2 children was tough for Janet, especially since her husband was constantly away on duty. At the time, he was in Japan, and rumors increasingly reached the young wife that Eddie had found a girlfriend to keep him company in another country. Janet acted like a child. Instead of confronting her husband, she decided to leave everything behind, including her husband and 2 children. Ed felt betrayed and filed for divorce, then took 4-year-old Nancy and 3-year-old Eddie to Japan. Nancy's childhood was spent in various cities because the family moved frequently. Eventually, her father settled in Mountain Home, Idaho, remarried, and had 3 more children. Meanwhile, Nancy's mother, Janet, managed to remarry and divorce again. Despite her mother's long absence, Nancy was forgiving about her return. Regardless of distance and time, she loved her mother more than anything in the world and believed she deserved a second chance to be a good parent. In 1983, Nancy moved with Janet to the small Texas town of Graham, with a population of about 8,500. Nancy's grandparents lived there. The girl grew very close to her mother, and they were often mistaken for sisters because they did everything together. To help her mother pay the bills, Nancy first took a job as a waitress, then a second job at a pizzeria. In high school, she worked, studied, and participated in several beauty pageants. She was a vibrant blonde with a radiant smile, beautiful not only on the outside, but also on the inside. People who knew Nancy said she was cheerful and outgoing, had many friends, and easily made new ones. She could spend hours on the phone chatting with her girlfriends or disappear until late in the evening, roller skating, bowling, or walking in nature. In winter, she loved skiing and ice fishing. Nancy was in her senior year of high school when, in mid-February, she met the man of her dreams. His name was Anthony Todd DePriest, and he was a few years older. Todd worked on a ranch and dreamed of joining the U.S. Air Force. Returning home after that fateful meeting, Nancy excitedly told her mother she had met a young man she wanted to marry. Of course, Janet wasn't thrilled. Her daughter strongly reminded her of her own youth and her first failed marriage. She didn't want Nancy to repeat her mistakes. The woman hoped her daughter would finish high school and attend college before starting a family. But Nancy was resolute in this matter. If she wanted something, she simply did it. The girl fell deeply in love with Todd, and on her birthday, March 4th, she moved in with him in Grand Bay. On May 1st, 1986, they got married. Nancy graduated high school as a married woman. Janet, her mother, tried her best to accept the new circumstances, realizing that the only way to maintain a relationship with her daughter was to learn to love her man, Todd, and allow Nancy to make her own decisions. Soon, Nancy learned she was pregnant with a girl. At that moment, she felt completely happy, because her daughter became the missing link in their young family. Nancy dreamed of being the most loving and caring mother. Her husband, Todd, also fulfilled his dream. He joined the Air Force and, by December, landed a job as an aircraft maintenance specialist. In 1986, the DePriest couple moved to Austin, Texas, where Todd worked at a military base and Nancy got a job at a Pizza Hut, quickly climbing the career ladder. Coming from a small town, the young woman fell in love with the hustle and bustle of the big city, but she fell even more in love with the Pizza Hut community. At the time, the chain was quite popular. Employees sometimes worked at different locations, covered for each other, and organized softball tournaments. Over 2 years, Nancy worked at 3 different locations and wholeheartedly loved the Pizza Hut team. In July 1987, in the midst of Austin's humid, sticky heat, little Sylvia DePriest was born. The girl came into the world with a thick head of dark hair, like her father's, making her young parents the happiest people alive. Sylvia had just been born, and Nancy was already dreaming of when she'd grow up enough to buy her a little toy car. In April 1988, Nancy started working at the Pizza Hut on Rainey Street as an assistant manager. The young mother showed her colleagues family photos, saying that Todd and Sylvia were the greatest joy in her life. All the employees knew how much Nancy loved her family, and deep down, they were a little jealous. At the same time, she was an excellent leader, responsible, moderately strict, and always ready to help. In October 1988, Nancy was 20 years old, and her little daughter was just over a year old. The young mother spent the first half of the day with baby Sylvia and worked at the pizzeria in the evenings. Additionally, Nancy was one of the most dedicated players on the Pizza Hut softball team. It wasn't that she loved sports so much. The young woman simply enjoyed being involved in her company's life and socializing with different people at events. On Monday, October 24th, Nancy DePriest was scheduled to work the second shift as usual, but that evening, the company had planned another softball game, so Nancy swapped shifts with another manager and arranged for a babysitter to watch Sylvia. In the morning, Nancy put her daughter in a car seat and drove to work. Her husband, Todd, followed them on his motorcycle since the couple only had one car and had to coordinate with each other. At 7 a.m., the woman started her shift at the pizzeria, and her husband took the wheel of the car to drop Sylvia off at the babysitter's. Around 7:40 a.m., he returned to the Pizza Hut, knocked on the service exit door, handed the car keys to his wife, and kissed her goodbye. He then rode his motorcycle toward the Air Force base. He didn't yet know that he had seen Nancy alive for the last time. The restaurant opened for customers at 11 a.m., but the manager needed to prepare in the morning, check supplies, and set the dough for pizzas. When Nancy was alone in the restaurant, she usually locked all the doors, but that morning was different. The general manager of the Pizza Hut chain couldn't reach his employee for an hour, calling from 9:30 to 10:30 a.m. It was almost opening time, but no one answered at the restaurant. This was strange because Nancy always took her job very seriously. Perhaps she forgot she had swapped shifts. The manager decided to go to the restaurant and check the situation in person. He was immediately surprised that the service exit was unlocked. This meant Nancy had made it to the pizzeria, but apparently forgot to lock up. Surveying the dining area, the manager noticed the restaurant floor was covered in water. Apparently, a faucet had broken, or a pipe had burst. He called out to Nancy but got no response. He could hear the dough mixing machine running in the kitchen, but the employee wasn't there. It seemed the water was coming from the men's restroom. The manager realized why Nancy wasn't answering. She was probably fixing the leak. Opening the restroom door, the man was met with a horrifying sight. Barely holding back a scream, he rushed out of the building and immediately called emergency services. While waiting for the police and ambulance, the gruesome scene still flashed before his eyes. Nancy DePriest's light hair was stained red, and a pool of blood under her head mixed with the water. The young woman was naked, but what shocked the manager most was her lifeless gaze, staring into the void. The police who arrived at the scene went straight to the men's restroom, as directed by the manager. On the floor under the sink, they indeed found the girl. She had presumably suffered a gunshot wound to the head. When one of the officers approached the victim, he noticed she was still breathing. The policeman spoke to her, trying to bring her to consciousness, but unfortunately she couldn't respond as she began to choke. At that moment, the ambulance arrived, and the girl was placed on a stretcher and rushed to the hospital, where she underwent emergency surgery and was connected to a life support machine. Her condition was critical, with little chance of survival, but the doctors continued to fight for her life. Meanwhile, investigators from the Austin Police Department were called to the Pizza Hut. The restaurant was closed to customers. The detectives first determined the cause of the flooding. It turned out that a blue apron had been stuffed into the sink's drain, and water from the faucet was spilling onto the floor. This was clearly the perpetrator's attempt to wash away evidence. On the floor near the toilet lay khaki pants, a piece of light blue underwear, and a trash can lid. Nearby was a white button-up dress shirt with bloodstains. It appeared to be Nancy DePriest's clothing. The perpetrator had tied the woman's hands behind her back with her bra. Despite attempts to remove evidence, the criminal left behind one .22 caliber shell casing. All physical evidence was collected and sent to the forensic laboratory for analysis. Certain aspects of the crime suggested the perpetrator was a man. Since Nancy was naked, the investigators assumed she had likely been assaulted. There were no signs of a break-in. This raised a legitimate question. Did the restaurant employee open the door herself, or did the perpetrator have a key? In the dining area, the detectives found a hair without a root. This made it very difficult to identify whom it belonged to, but it was still evidence. In 1988, Austin experienced a series of robberies targeting Pizza Hut restaurants, as people mostly paid in cash at the time. During 4 robberies that occurred in the late evening or early morning, no one was harmed, so a connection to the prior crimes was unlikely. Still, the investigators checked the cash register and the safe in the back office just in case. Based on the receipts, it turned out that the previous day's revenue was missing. All this time, the detectives hoped that Nancy DePriest, the victim and witness to the crime, would survive and be able to tell them what happened and identify the robber. But, unfortunately, that was not to be. After surgery, Nancy was connected to life support and remained in a coma. Her body clung to life with its last strength, but the doctor's prognosis was grim. The young woman held on for only a few hours. The doctors allowed her relatives to say goodbye before disconnecting her from the machine. DePriest's death weighed heavily on the hearts of her loved ones. Her husband, Todd, was left alone with his grief. They had a little girl, Sylvia, and taking her mother away from such a young child was inhumane. Nancy's mother, Janet, had a complete breakdown. She simply couldn't believe her daughter had fallen victim to robbers. The woman cried, screamed that it was impossible, but deep down, she knew Nancy wouldn't have wanted to exist in such a state. When the doctors confirmed that the girl had irreversible injuries and her condition was sustained only by the machine, the relatives made the hardest decision of their lives. Yet, even in this dire situation, Nancy DePriest was able to help others. Her heart, liver, kidneys, and bone marrow extended someone else's life, as the deceased woman became an organ donor for those in need of transplants. The forensic medical examination confirmed the cause of death as a gunshot wound to the head. Nancy had an entry wound just above her left ear. Her hair in that area had been cut. There were no stippling marks on the wound, indicating the shot was fired from a distance. The bullet passed through the skull from the back and lodged in the orbitofrontal cortex of the brain. The .22 caliber mushroom-shaped lead bullet was extracted and preserved as evidence. The coroner also noted that the woman had been assaulted by the perpetrator. DNA extracted from the perpetrator's semen was added to the case file. But at the time, it was essentially useless, as criminals were typically identified by blood type. Thus, the investigation of the pizzeria robbery turned into an investigation of the murder of Nancy DePriest. The detectives first considered the theory that the victim knew her attacker and had let the perpetrator inside herself. Whether it was a colleague, friend, relative, or just an acquaintance remained to be determined, and the police got to work. Naturally, they first checked Nancy's husband, Todd, but the man had a solid alibi. That morning, he was at the military base, where dozens of people saw him. The detective leading the case of the attack on the Pizza Hut employee calculated the approximate time of the crime. At 7 a.m., Nancy arrived at work. At 7:40 a.m., her husband Todd brought her the car keys. Around 8:30 a.m., DePriest called a supply company to order products for the restaurant, and around 10 a.m., the general manager found Nancy on the men's restroom floor. Thus, the crime occurred between 8:30 and 10 a.m. The DePriest case made headlines in Texas newspapers and was reported on radio and television news programs. The public was frightened and put pressure on law enforcement, demanding that the case be solved quickly and the criminal be put behind bars. The problem was that in 1988, Austin saw over 40 different crimes resulting in fatalities, all requiring immediate investigation. The homicide department had only 6 detectives, who physically couldn't keep up with conducting all procedures thoroughly, and they could be called to a new crime scene at any time of day or night. Sometimes they worked 24 hours a day without sleep or rest. Like anyone, many officers experienced professional burnout, their goal being to close each case as quickly as possible due to pressure from authorities and the public. Victims' families called the police station daily, asking for updates on their cases. The lead detective on Nancy DePriest's case was also eager to resolve everything quickly, but the investigation dragged on for 2 weeks since the police had no leads. Finally, the Pizza Hut where Nancy worked reopened to customers. The management implemented security measures, hoping to prevent other possible attacks. A guard was stationed at the restaurant's entrance to monitor all suspicious guests, both inside and outside, and report each one to the police. The detectives hoped the criminal would eventually return to the crime scene, as often happens, and one day they got lucky. On November 9th, the guard was at his post when he overheard a conversation between 2 visitors mentioning Nancy DePriest's name. He slowly turned his head and carefully scanned the room, noticing 2 young men sitting at one of the tables. They were drinking beer and discussing the crime that had occurred at the pizzeria. Then one of the young men stood up and approached the guard to ask about the details of Nancy's death. He introduced himself as Richard and started asking a slew of questions about the murder of the Pizza Hut employee. When the guard asked why he was so interested in the young woman's murder, Richard explained that he was also a manager, just at a different restaurant. At the time of the attack on Nancy, he was also working the morning shift, preparing to open a pizzeria at another location. Apparently, Richard realized the guard wouldn't tell him anything, so both young men left the restaurant without even finishing their beers. The whole situation seemed quite strange, so the guard passed the information to the manager, who, in turn, called the police and reported the odd visitors. The detective leading the DePriest case was intrigued by these 2 guys. The main reason was that Pizza Hut managers and shift supervisors like Nancy had a universal key to access all restaurants in the chain. This meant key holders could enter any pizzeria in Austin. The police quickly identified the employees who showed an unusual interest in Nancy's murder. They were 18-year-old Richard Danziger and his friend, 22-year-old Christopher Ochoa. Richard was indeed a manager, and Chris worked as a cook at Pizza Hut. Undoubtedly, both knew the layout of the chain's restaurants, and Richard had a key. The young men were brought to the police station for questioning. When Richard was asked what he knew about the murder of Nancy DePriest, the guy honestly said he had heard about the blue apron used to clog the men's restroom sink to flood the evidence, and then mentioned that someone had supposedly said Nancy was shot in the back of the head with a .22 caliber pistol. The detectives immediately felt that Richard and Chris were somehow involved in the attack on the pizzeria. The guys knew information that wasn't covered in the media. So where could they have learned about the weapon's caliber and the apron's color? That was the question the detectives posed to Richard Danziger. The young man couldn't immediately recall who he had heard these details from, then named another employee. However, as the police later found out, none of Richard's colleagues had said anything like that. This information could only have been known to someone at the crime scene. Richard denied any involvement in the girl's death. Another suspicious detail was that on the morning Nancy was killed, Danziger was late for work. He showed up just after 10. His reason for being late was the most common one. The night before, Richard had been drinking with his girlfriend and a friend, and he overslept. This alibi wasn't exactly reliable. After all, his girlfriend and friend could have conspired with Danziger and lied. Since there was no direct evidence against Richard, he was released. Then Chris Ochoa was called in for questioning. The guy was very surprised that their interest in the crime at the pizzeria, where they worked with Danziger, had provoked such a police reaction. The attack on Nancy was the talk of the town, yet questions were only being asked of them. At that moment, Chris didn't yet realize that fate had pitted him against Sergeant Hector Polanco, the lead detective on the DePriest case, who was ready to do anything to catch the criminal. This policeman had a reputation for closing his cases quickly and dirtily, not caring if he was wrong in some instances. The leadership demanded higher clearance rates, and how Polanco achieved them didn't matter. The sergeant immediately sensed that, unlike Richard, Chris could be pressured. If the guys were guilty of something, he would crack quickly. So when Ochoa started telling the same story Danziger had just shared, Detective Polanco lost his temper. He jumped up from his seat and started yelling at the detainee. The sergeant pounded his fist on the table and painted a picture of the grim future awaiting Chris, talking about the death penalty facing criminals. The worst part was that the sergeant wasn't playing good cop, bad cop. Polanco was genuinely a bad cop, and he terrified the young man. The detective showed Chris a photo of the death row chamber, promising he'd never again have the chance to hug his family. Then he showed a photo from Nancy's autopsy to shock the guy even more. When Ochoa still didn't confess, the sergeant changed tactics. Polanco began pressing that the murder was orchestrated by his friend Richard, who was in the next room trying to pin the blame on Chris to save himself. The detective described what Chris's life in prison would be like, how he'd be fresh meat for the other inmates and would bear responsibility for his friend if he didn't tell how Danziger killed Nancy DePriest. Chris continued to insist he knew nothing, but a 20-hour interrogation and the refusal to provide a lawyer took their toll. The young man was exhausted both mentally and physically. His only desire was to go home and forget it all like a bad dream. That's when he began to break. Chris Ochoa changed his story and was ready to make a statement. The young man confessed that he and Richard had attacked Nancy with the intent to rob. After taking the money from the safe, they decided to have some fun and satisfy their male desires. According to Chris, Danziger was the mastermind, and Ochoa detailed what they did to the girl. Then, realizing she would turn them in to the police, they simply shot her. That was exactly the information the detective wanted to hear. Eventually, they took DNA samples from Christopher for analysis, though in the 80s this didn't yield much. They also put the guy on a polygraph, and he failed the test, though a lie detector test didn't guarantee 100% accuracy either. For the police, this was another piece of evidence to add to the confession. On November 14, 1988, Christopher Ochoa was officially charged with the murder of Nancy DePriest. His accomplice, Richard Danziger, was arrested the next day. Now it remained to find evidence linking the young men to Nancy's death. Detective Polanco himself was 99% sure he had caught the criminals. Nancy's family also breathed a sigh of relief, as justice had caught up with the killers with astonishing speed. But coming to terms with the death of their 20-year-old daughter and wife was no easy task. Janet, Nancy's mother, couldn't even imagine what her girl had gone through. It was hard for her to hear the details of the horrific tragedy that had befallen Nancy. The woman sank into a deep depression, showing signs of self-harm. Janet smoked 4 packs of cigarettes a day. She lost over 13 kilograms. It's unknown how it might have ended if the older sister of the deceased hadn't convinced the grief-stricken mother to channel her anger and hatred over Nancy's death, not toward herself, but toward those who took her daughter's life. Nancy's death also left a huge void in Todd DePriest's soul. He couldn't comprehend that his young wife would never come home again, that their daughter Sylvia would have to grow up without a mother, that his soul remained with Nancy. Meanwhile, the two Pizza Hut employees accused of attacking DePriest and robbing the restaurant's cash register were in a detention center awaiting trial. Even the lawyer hired by Chris's relatives didn't believe the young man had been coerced into confessing to a crime he supposedly didn't commit. The defense attorney saw the forensic results, which partially matched Ochoa's blood samples and Danziger's hair. The lawyer explained to his client that, given the brutality of the attack, Chris's confession and the DNA results, both faced the death penalty, and the only way to avoid it was to plead guilty. Christopher Ochoa, despite the inconclusive DNA comparison results, fully admitted his guilt. Moreover, he testified against his friend and alleged accomplice, Richard Danziger. Under the terms of a plea deal for the murder of Nancy DePriest, the young man was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. Danziger, unlike Chris, had no intention of confessing to something he supposedly didn't do, so he faced a full trial. Richard's trial began on January 22, 1990. As evidence, the prosecution team used the hair found at the crime scene and traces of semen. DNA comparison technology in those years was far from modern, but the analysis established a partial match. Chris Ochoa, now in the courtroom, recounted a horrifying story of what they did to Nancy. The guy methodically listed how and with what they tied her up, who attacked first, what the girl said, and so on. The moment Janet, Nancy's mother, heard that her daughter had begged for her life, she felt physically ill. When she left the courtroom, she was sick to her stomach over what those vile people had done to her girl. The image of Nancy pleading to be spared, worrying about little Sylvia, only to receive a bullet to the back of the head after all the assaults, haunted her. What infuriated Janet most was that Richard stared her straight in the eyes the whole time, as if he didn't consider himself guilty. Given Ochoa's testimony and the evidence from the crime scene, Danziger was also found guilty and sentenced to life imprisonment without parole. Nancy's parents, Janet and Eddie, felt complete relief that, 15 months after their beloved daughter's death, they could sleep soundly. The guilty would now be forced to pay for their crimes for the rest of their lives. But in reality, things were not at all as many had imagined. The time the two young men spent behind bars was horrific, but it was better than losing their lives in the prime of youth. For years, Ochoa repeatedly confessed to other inmates that he and his friend Richard Danziger had sent an innocent young woman to her death. Since Janet buried her daughter, she was haunted by the same nightmare. Nancy in the Pizza Hut in Austin, stripped naked in the restroom, kneeling on the cold, dirty floor while someone invisible pushes her. Sobbing, Nancy begs for mercy, but her pleas go unanswered and she cries, "Mom, help me." Then there's a pause, brief as it is, followed by a gunshot, loud enough to jolt Janet out of the nightmare. All the mother's thoughts revolved around one thing. If only she had been there when Nancy was little. If only she had stopped her daughter from marrying so young. If only she had been a good mother. Her girl would be alive now, graduating college. It seemed nothing could dispel these nightmares. Not the life sentences of the two criminals for Nancy's murder. Not the therapy sessions she agreed to. Not the antidepressants prescribed by the doctor. Even time, the best healer, didn't help her. Janet continued to blame herself for not spending enough time with her children when they were young. On October 24, 2000, the 12th anniversary of her daughter's death, Janet, as usual, prayed for Nancy, standing before a striking color portrait of her daughter, which hung like a shrine in the hallway of her modest home. The phone rang just after 7 a.m. It was her son-in-law who told her to urgently turn on the TV. Janet stood in front of the screen, unable to grasp the meaning of the words. Would she have to go through all this again? She couldn't take it anymore. The woman covered her face with her hands and silently wept, as there were hardly any tears left after all these years. While Chris Ochoa and Richard Danziger were serving life sentences for the attack on the Pizza Hut manager, another inmate in a Texas prison, named Akim Joseph Marino, was writing and sending letters to various institutions. After a religious awakening in 1996, Marino wanted to atone for his sins. He contacted the Austin police, the local newspaper, the American Civil Liberties Union, and the then Texas governor, George Bush, but none of them took his message seriously. Marino was serving 3 life sentences for serious crimes, but he was guilty of 1 more death, for which others had been convicted. And now, Joseph was tormented by guilt. The convicted Marino provided the Austin police with information that directly led investigators to the discovery of restaurant keys, handcuffs, a .22 caliber pistol he used in the attack, and 2 bags of money he took from the restaurant. But instead of investigating, the police simply ignored Marino's words and evidence. The authorities didn't conduct a DNA analysis to link the evidence to the crime. They didn't perform a ballistics test to match the shell casings found at the scene with Joseph's gun. They already had 2 inmates serving time for the murder of Nancy DePriest, and the evidence against them seemed convincing enough. Why stir up the past again? Only in 2000, under pressure from the Innocence Project, represented by a group of law students from the University of Wisconsin-Madison, did Texas authorities finally investigate Marino's gun and the male DNA from Nancy DePriest's body. The evidence matched perfectly, and a re-examination completely ruled out Chris Ochoa and Richard Danziger as the perpetrators of the murder of the Pizza Hut manager. After 12 years, Christopher Ochoa was released from prison. All charges against him were dropped, and he was awarded over $5 million in compensation for his wrongful conviction. Chris's false confession, made under police pressure, not only affected his fate, but also completely ruined Richard Danziger's life. While in prison, Richard was attacked by another inmate, Armando Gutierrez. Gutierrez knocked Danziger to the ground and struck him multiple times on the head with a sharp-toed boot. The blows caused part of the man's skull to penetrate his brain. The injured man was taken to a nearby hospital, where part of his brain was removed during emergency surgery. Due to the injuries, Richard suffered from partial paralysis, seizures, anxiety, and mental disorders. Danziger often couldn't hold a simple conversation or recognize family members. Eventually, he was transferred to a psychiatric prison in Kirbyville, where he was to remain for the rest of his days. After that incident, Richard suffered irreversible brain damage, became disabled, and required lifelong care. Richard Danziger was also released from prison. He received $9 million in compensation for moral damages. But that money couldn't restore the health of a young man full of strength and hope for the future, who had simply been in the wrong place at the wrong time. On the 12th anniversary of her daughter's death, Janet, Nancy's mother, heard on the TV that Chris Ochoa and Richard Danziger, the monsters who took her daughter's life, were about to be released. For all those years, she believed those 2 guys had assaulted and then shot Nancy. Janet had attended Danziger's trial, listening as the prosecution's main witness, Chris Ochoa, described the crime's details in horrifying detail. Could it all have been a lie and a terrible miscarriage of justice? At the trial, Akim Joseph Marino testified that on the morning of October 24, 1988, posing as a vending machine repairman, he tricked his way into the restaurant where Nancy DePriest was. When the young woman opened the door for the repairman, she unknowingly signed her own death warrant. Akim was a man who had heard voices in his head since childhood, and that day he felt compelled to sacrifice someone. He didn't understand why, but he was certain he was doing the right thing. Later, a psychiatrist evaluating the defendant concluded that the man had difficulty distinguishing right from wrong and had mental health issues. Inside the restaurant, Marino, threatening with a gun, took money from the safe, tied the girl's hands with her own bra, and decided to have his way with her. When he was done, he stepped away from his victim, pulled out the gun, and shot Nancy in the head. She didn't even have time to say anything, as she didn't expect it to end like that. Then the man wiped fingerprints off the counters and frantically searched for the spent .22 caliber shell casing that had ejected from his gun. Unable to find it, he hurried to escape. When the full truth about the crime committed by Marino came to light, Janet realized that Ochoa and Danziger were innocent. Her heart filled with compassion for the mothers of the two young men. Now, instead of anger and hatred toward them, she felt sympathy, as Chris and Richard's parents had lost their children for 12 years. There was no doubt that Ochoa and Danziger had been framed by the police. The case against them was fabricated. Detective Polanco immediately realized it would be hard to make Richard confess to something he didn't do. But the soft and timid Chris, who unquestioningly believed in the power of authority, broke after being threatened with violence. He confessed to a crime he didn't commit and implicated his friend. Polanco, unfortunately, wasn't the only Austin policeman who behaved abusively toward suspects. In 1992, an investigative team found that excessive workload, inadequate training, and lack of proper oversight repeatedly led to false confessions. The team also noted that Austin police detectives often withheld information that was inconvenient for their investigations. Even when the Austin police received Joseph Marino's confession letter and found undeniable evidence at his mother's house, the detectives tried to tie all three men together, despite Marino's initial statement that he acted alone and had no accomplices. The investigators refused to admit their mistakes until the very end. It's unknown how it might have ended if the Innocence Project hadn't taken up Ochoa's case. Christopher later admitted he was close to taking his own life just to avoid bearing the burden of responsibility for a crime he didn't actually commit. Nancy DePriest's mother, Janet, went to the prison and spoke with Marino to learn the details of her daughter's death. She was comforted by the fact that Nancy didn't even have time to grasp the full tragedy. The woman opposed the death penalty for Joseph Marino, believing the criminal should spend the rest of his life answering for the consequences of his actions. Marino's trial took place in October 2002, and he received another life sentence. Christopher Ochoa graduated from the University of Wisconsin-Madison Law School and now works as a lawyer. Richard Danziger died in 2021. Nancy's mother, Janet, passed away in 2019 at the age of 69. In her final years, the woman battled lung cancer. Todd DePriest, Sylvia, and the rest of the family were left with memories of Nancy, a hard-working, devoted, sweet, cheerful, and vibrant young woman, as she was in life. If you have finished watching, you are a real fan of true crime. Subscribe to the channel, turn on the bell notifications, and put the like. See you in the next video. There is no smoke without fire, and in today's history, this is not just a metaphor. Fire is terrible in itself. It devours everything in its path, causing irreversible damage. And when it is used to erase evidence and hide crimes, horror only multiplies. It all started with the fact that in an ordinary residential complex, the neighbors noticed black smoke with an unpleasant smell coming from the balcony of the apartment on the second floor. It would seem nothing strange. A young man was cooking a barbecue in his own lodging. The problem was that he did it non-stop, all day and all night, for several days in a row. And it was more like not cooking, but burning something. One of the neighbors was worried that the fire was approaching close to the balcony roof. In the end, he could not stand it and called 911. By the time the firefighters arrived, the fire had subsided, and the tenant from apartment 224 assured them that everything was under control. Another resident of the house directly asked the young man what he was doing on the balcony, and he explained that he was cooking food for a big event. However, the same tenant noticed that the guy from apartment 224 had burned out all the contents of 2 grills and took away the nearest garbage can. Constant burning and stench spreading around the area made the entire residential complex nervous. They were all afraid to find out the alarming truth about what was hiding behind this inescapable flame. And their fears were not groundless, because soon the usual atmosphere of apartment 224 turned into an icy blood place of crime. And before we get started, be kind enough to support my channel. Subscribe to the channel, like the video, and stay active. It will help a lot. I will be very grateful to you for that. Let's get started. The 19-year-old girl returned home for the spring holidays. She was excited about the upcoming week of fun, meetings with friends, and, most importantly, preparing to see her idol Beyoncé live. This evening was supposed to be the best in her life. She made plans, did her hair, chose her outfit, and then suddenly stopped answering calls and messages from best friends, mom, and even professors from college. She didn't show up at classes when the holidays were over. She just disappeared from all radars. When the police began to collect information together, it was too late. What started as a case of a missing person turned into something much more sinister, so unthinkable that even experienced detectives were horrified. They have never encountered anything like this. This is the case of Tynesha Stewart. Tanisha Devona Stewart was born on July 10, 1987. Her childhood cannot be called perfect because her parents divorced when she was very young, and at the age of 6, Tanisha first encountered a tragedy. Her father died of a brain aneurysm. After the divorce, the mother of the girl, Gail, remarried, and Tanisha had a caring stepfather, and then a younger sister was born. So the girl grew up in a full family where her loved ones respected, loved, and valued each other. The family lived in Borders Village, Texas. Tanisha grew up as an ordinary child. She was organized, responsible, studied well at school. In her teenage years, like most children, Tanisha struggled with complexes and self-doubt. She began to quarrel with her stepfather, but as an adult, she coped with her disadvantages and tried to turn them into advantages. She had big dreams and a huge desire to achieve something grandiose in life. Tanisha studied in a high school known for its graduates who reached unprecedented heights in sports, but Stewart did not like sports. Instead, she took on the role of a basketball team manager and led the players outside the sports field. She also loved to sing and performed the national anthem at games. Inspired by popular music and uniting with other girls, she even created her own music group at school. Tanisha managed to combine courses, improve her qualifications in non-class events, and work on a part-time basis. According to the school director, she was one of the most ambitious students. Every day she did something to get closer to her dream. The biggest goal of Tanisha was Texas AANDM University. She wanted to become a construction engineer and had already received several scholarships for a total amount of $40,000 for an excellent graduation from high school. Her aspirations and determination to achieve goals were phenomenal, and all the more devastating, it seems, what happened to her. Tanisha's first real boyfriend was Curtis, a handsome, popular middle school boy, in love with one and only. All his attention was focused on Stewart. He opened the door for her, held her hand, treated her as if she were the most important person on earth. She liked it. They were a couple at all school events, as well as on graduation night. Many envied the girl and dreamed of being in her place. Everyone knows that first love is rarely the last. It is passionate, but very unpredictable. Tanisha and Curtis either stopped their relationship or resumed it. At the same time, the young man always stayed close, loved, respected, and wanted the best for his girlfriend. And then, everything fell apart. At the third year of college, Tanisha worked a part-time job in a pizzeria where the delivery driver was Timothy Shepard. At the first meeting, a spark seemed to fly between them. The girl finally broke up with Curtis and began dating Timothy. And it was not just a random school romance. Now everything was serious. There was one thing that no one knew about for a long time. Timothy was 8 years older than Tanisha. He was 24, and she was only 16. The girl did not tell anyone about it, afraid that her mother and stepfather would not approve of their romance. Being in ignorance, Tanisha's family immediately fell in love with Timothy. Mother, stepfather, and sister believed that sooner or later everything would end with a wedding. Shepard was charming. He not only met Tanisha, he became part of the Stewart family. He was present at all family events, hung out with her younger sister, until, in the end, the young people began to live together. When Tynesha graduated from high school in 2006 and entered Texas AANDM University in the fall, she and Timothy decided to continue their relationship at a distance. But it didn't last long. Stuart didn't have time to leave, and Timothy's ex-girlfriend was drawn on the horizon, and they met. Tynesha experienced betrayal for the first time, but despite the fact that she was morally depressed, she continued to move forward, regardless of who was next to her. A completely different world opened up for the girl at the university. She felt truly independent, new acquaintances, new experiences, new opportunities. Timothy enjoyed his relationship with his ex-girlfriend for a short time, and soon realized that he had made a mistake. He missed Tynesha and wanted to get her back. The guy left everything and rushed to college. Of course, the girl was definitely surprised. They talked to Timothy and realized that they were still experiencing tender feelings for each other. The couple tried to build a relationship at a distance again. The reality was that over time, Tynesha began to change and grow emotionally. Now she no longer saw the point of clinging to the past. It was at this time that the girl met Mark, a classmate. Mark was her peer. Their thoughts and desires coincided. And although a part of her heart still belonged to Timothy Shepard, the student understood that their romance had come to an end. About 2 years later, Tynesha made a choice. She decided to end it forever and began to spend time with Mark. Young people were not in a hurry. At first, there was just friendship and a slight flirtation between them. They just enjoyed each other's company. All this time, she also continued to communicate with Timothy, wishing to remain on good terms with him. In her imagination, love and friendship could exist together. By March 2007, Tynesha was already used to student life. The exciting future was ahead of her. And most importantly, the girl was happy. She counted the days until the spring holidays, looking forward to reuniting with friends from her hometown and the opportunity to go to the performance of her idol, Beyoncé. The concert was to take place on March 15th in Houston. Then Tynesha planned to go to the island of South Padre and only then return to the campus. On March 14th, 2007, the girls spent the evening preparing for tomorrow's event. Together with former classmates, they made hairstyles for each other, laughed until they fell, and remembered school stories. Stuart was going to spend the night at her friend Lois's apartment. In the evening, she called her mother and asked for permission to take a car for tomorrow's concert. The woman agreed. She was happy for her daughter. The only thing her mother didn't know yet was that it would be their last conversation, because Tynesha never showed up at the concert. She disappeared from her friend's apartment and stopped answering calls. Lois realized that her friend was in trouble because Tynesha would never just miss Beyoncé's concert. She planned it in advance. When Stuart did not appear the next morning, on March 16th, her friends got worried. Lois contacted Gail, Tynesha's mother, and she said that she had not heard anything from her daughter since Wednesday evening. Panic grew. Stuart's family realized that something serious had happened because Tynesha would never make them worry for no reason. She would definitely let them know about herself. Gail called all her daughter's friends and her former classmates, but no one heard anything about Tynesha. Then, just in case, her mother dialed the number of her ex-boyfriend Timothy Shepard, hoping that he was talking to her daughter and was aware of her plans. The guy admitted that he talked to Tynesha on Thursday night, but after that, he did not see her. It was the night before the concert, so Timothy was probably the last person who contacted the missing girl. Gail could not wait any longer. She began her own investigation. She went straight to Timothy to talk to him face to face and collect additional information. Although the whole family loved Shepard when he met Tynesha, now the mother treated him carefully. She herself could not explain the cause of these changes. It was some kind of inner feeling, and now that her daughter was gone, this feeling had intensified. Timothy calmly explained to Gail that he met Tynesha on the night of March 14th, after her party with her friends. He drove up to her apartment in Lois's place. Ex-lovers went to him, but then at 3 o'clock in the morning, the girls called. Timothy immediately realized that this was her new boyfriend and, in a fit of jealousy, questioned why he was calling her at such a time. Tynesha refused to discuss her relationship with Mark and just left. It was about 4 or 5 in the morning, so she left on foot alone in the middle of the night. On Monday, March 19th, Gail filled out an official statement on the disappearance of a person. She gave the officers a full description of her daughter. Tanesha Devona Stewart, 19 years old, height 156 centimeters, weighed about 54 kilograms, black hair, brown eyes. Of the special features, tattoos on the right thigh and back. The last time she was seen by Lois in a white shirt and rainbow-colored pajamas. Gail expected the police to start acting right away, but instead, they just waved it off. According to the officer, an adult girl on spring holidays could just be detained somewhere. The mother was sent home, advised to be patient and call after the weekend, but Gail knew perfectly well that her daughter was not the person who needed free space. She had to be at the concert, and then she had to return to classes at the college. If Tynesha was going to go somewhere, she would just let her parents know. Days went by, and nothing happened. There were no answers. There was nothing left for the family but to take matters into their own hands. They pasted up leaflets, walked around the streets of the city and forest ranges, called hospitals and morgues, talked to friends and classmates of Tynesha, with everyone who could see her. Close relatives of the missing girl desperately tried to find at least some clue about her whereabouts. When classes started at the university, Tynesha was still listed as missing. Even the teachers were surprised that the student did not come to study and tried to reach her. The fears in the family grew to the limit, not receiving any help from the police and not knowing what else to do. They organized a meeting in the Lutheran church to draw the attention of the community to the disappearance of Tynesha. This definitely helped. The sheriff's assistant, who worked in the missing persons department, was finally interested in this case. After learning that the girl was last seen in the apartment of Timothy Shepard, the police went to the apartment complex. However, no one opened the door. Then the officers contacted the manager of the apartment complex, who reported that 2 days earlier, a fire had been recorded in Shepard's apartment. Another neighbor noted that he heard shots in the forest adjacent to the complex, which prompted the police to call a canine unit and search the wooded area. Almost immediately, the dogs found an unmistakable smell of decay a few dozen meters from the apartment complex, and the closer they came, the stronger the stench became. In fact, it turned out that the smell came from a dead animal. For a moment, there was a sense of relief, but then it was replaced by fear because Tynesha was still missing. At that moment, the sheriff's deputy decided to find out what kind of fire happened in Shepard's apartment. It turned out that the neighbors were worried because thick black smoke was coming from the balcony of apartment number 224 for several hours in a row. And then the barbecue grill lit up completely. Residents called firefighters, but Shepard refused to let them in, explaining that he was just cooking meat on his balcony right on several grills next to each other, and there was no danger. Indeed, when the firefighters arrived at the scene, there was no fire or smoke. Somehow, convincing the young man that they needed to make sure that there was no fire, the firefighters inspected the apartment. In the bathroom, they found a pile of melted ice and pieces of meat. They had no idea what kind of meat it was. They were called there because of the fire. Guarding the bathroom, whatever it is not a crime, and frying meat on a grill in your own house is also not prohibited. The firefighters left, and Timothy returned to his business, at least until the sheriff's assistant called him and summoned him to the police station for interrogation. Shepard told the detectives the same story that he had told her mother in secret before. He was completely calm and repeated that the girl had left his apartment when they argued over the night call of her boyfriend. She slammed the door and left on foot without any explanation. Timothy Shepard was released. The Stewart family unsuccessfully prayed for the safe return of Tynesha. They never received any answers from the police and felt that no one cared about their daughter and sister. The community was outraged by the lack of clear actions by the authorities. They believed that the media often gave priority to missing white girls and did not move at all when it came to black people. The sister and cousin of Tynesha were associated with the public activist Quennell X. known for his work in the black community and the reform of the justice system. He became the voice of the families who were ignored by the authorities. He had a reputation as a person who was not a fan of law enforcement agencies. Quinnell promised to do everything possible to reveal the truth, and after his intervention, the police really began to take the case more seriously. Detectives found out that at the time of the disappearance, Tynesha was in a relationship with a young man named Mark and decided to talk to the young man. At first, Mark did not respond to any attempts by the police to contact him, and then he called back himself. In the end, he was interrogated, and he said that on March 17th, he went to the island of South Padre. The police found it strange that the guy left the city after the disappearance of Tynesha, but Mark explained that he tried to contact her, but Stewart did not answer. And when he was already in South Padre, he heard about her disappearance. The last person to see Tynesha alive was her ex-boyfriend, Timothy Shepard. It was on him that the detectives decided to focus their attention. They studied the past of the guy and talked to his neighbors. Timothy came from a decent family with a good reputation in society. His mother worked as a pharmacist. The biological father of the boy died when Timothy was only 2 months old, so he was raised by his stepfather. The Shepard family regularly visited the Missionary Baptist Church, where the stepfather served as a deacon and the mother sang in the choir. Timothy also had a younger sister who studied law at the University of Houston. The Shepards were a respected and friendly family. Timothy himself was the father of a 4-year-old daughter over whom he received full custody. He was described as a quiet, restrained, and well-mannered young man, as well as a devoted father who sincerely cared for his child. After graduating from high school, Timothy entered the university, but did not receive an official degree. At first glance, he led a relatively normal life, but detectives found out that the boy had some problems with the law in the past. This was due to the storage of banned substances. Although this was before the disappearance of Tynesha Stewart, the investigators decided to visit Shepard's apartment because before that, at the interrogation, he had already given written consent to the authorities to conduct a search in his house. As soon as the detectives entered, they immediately noticed 2 things: the smell of a mixture of bleach, ammonia, and something else, which they could not accurately determine. And then they smelled fresh paint. It seems that the owner was in a hurry to do repairs in the kitchen. The cabinets, walls, door frames, even the inner part of the tub under the sink were covered with white paint. But all this was done carelessly, in a hurry. Traces of bleach were visible on the carpet. This was a clear sign that the guy was trying to hide something. There was a dirty mop and a package of latex gloves. The sink and drain were carefully washed, as well as the bathroom itself. All this looked more than suspicious. However, several traces of blood were found. The use of luminol confirmed the worst suspicions of the investigators. The entire bathroom was blue. Spots and splashes were everywhere. The floor, walls, shower, toilet seat, tank, the entire bathroom was covered with blood. The investigators called experts who took DNA samples and collected possible evidence. Since it was necessary to wait for a report on the collected material, the detectives returned to inspect the area and talk to potential witnesses. In a fire report, 911 calls from the residents of the apartment complex arrived 3 days before Tynesha's mother officially announced her disappearance. One neighbor of Shepard said she smelled something like burnt tires. The flame was so high that she was afraid for the safety of her home. Another neighbor, who often played video games with Timothy, said that they used to fry meat often. He even left his grill in a friend's apartment. But when Shepard arranged a barbecue this time, he didn't even invite a friend to visit. Other residents heard a knock, the sound of running water, and the constant buzzing of a waste shredder in apartment number 224. Little by little, the details began to emerge in a very alarming picture. Timothy looked more and more like a suspect. Let's go back to the social activist Quinnell X. As it turned out, not only Tynesha's relatives, but also Shepard's cousin, who asked him to help protect Timothy from police brutality, were connected to him. Quinnell X, communicating with Tynesha's relatives and Timothy's relatives, learned a lot new about the relationship of the young people. It all started great. 2 in love, tender feelings, and serious plans for the future. But soon the relationship became unstable. Constant arguments and scandals began. After leaving for college, Tynesha admitted to her family that she was afraid of Timothy. Shepard was so used to controlling everything that his jealousy sometimes went beyond the limits of what was allowed. The guy called her constantly, wanting to know where she was and who she was spending the evening with. Even when they broke up, Timothy continued to call her neighbors in the room and find out what Tynesha was doing in her free time. And when they refused to talk to him, he left them angry messages. The girl did not tell her loved ones a lot, not wanting to make them nervous and worried about her. But a friend of Stuart admitted that once Timothy held her by the neck, threatening to strangle her and then kill her if she left him. And when she refused the ring on Valentine's Day that he wanted to give her, Timothy allegedly jokingly said that one day he would kill her, fry her on a grill, and feed her to dogs. It all happened about a year and a half ago. Since then, everything had calmed down a bit, and Shepard had stopped bothering her until February 2007. About a month before the spring holidays, he called again. Tynesha was worried that he would not let her rest in peace, and even thought about not returning to the city. But she so wanted to see her friends and loved ones that she tried to talk calmly and friendly with Timothy so as not to cause aggression toward her. The truth was that Tynesha still loved him, but knew that they had no future. That is why she agreed to meet him at night on the eve of her disappearance. Quanell X, wanting to hear Timothy's version of the events, called him and agreed to meet. When the public activist arrived at Shepard's apartment, Timothy was very nervous. His hands were shaking uncontrollably, his gaze was sweeping from side to side, and the young man himself was noticeably depressed. In the house, Quanell noticed a large number of luminol traces in the bathroom, which the forensic researchers had left. He looked at Timothy and asked if he knew what really happened to Tynesha. Shepard lowered his head and then admitted that the girl was not alive. He himself was very afraid of death and did not want to die. The public defender urged Shepard to think about the Stuart family, which desperately needed an answer, and asked not to prolong their suffering. Timothy brought Quanell X to a garbage container behind an apartment building located about 5 kilometers from his complex. The behavior of the young man immediately changed. He began to breathe heavily. His hands twitched nervously. Timothy did not even look at the garbage can, but when the container was opened, it was completely empty. By that time, all of its contents had already been sent to the landfill. Although the remains of Tynesha Stuart were never found, Shepard was arrested and charged with murder. The family of the deceased had one unbearable pain replaced by another. Now they knew that Tynesha was not alive, but they did not even have the opportunity to say goodbye to her and bury her in a human way. In the police station, Timothy took advantage of his right to a lawyer, but then changed his mind. When he was left alone in the interrogation room, he made a decision that shocked everyone. He wanted to confess to everything. According to Shepard, that night they quarreled with Tynesha because of her new boyfriend, Mark. The girl did not like that Timothy intervened in her life again. She grabbed a knife that happened to be on the table and swung, cutting his fingers. Shepard showed the officers a small scratch on his arm and continued the story. At first, he was afraid that Stuart would kill him, but then he got angry and threw himself at her. Timothy seemed to have snapped when he grabbed the neck of the ex-girlfriend with his right hand, and with his other hand, he tried to grab the knife. He clenched her neck until the weapon fell out of Tynesha's hand, and she herself collapsed and fell to the floor. Instead of calling 911, he decided to cover his tracks because he panicked and thought that no one would believe his version of events. Knowing that the police would look for the girl and find out what happened to her, Shepard placed her body in a large plastic container for storage and threw it into the garbage can that he later showed to Quanell X. When the detectives left the room, Timothy tried to kill himself. He put a belt around his neck and hooked it to the door handle. Naturally, his attempt was not successful. Meanwhile, the police were deciding what next step to take in the search for the body. The dump took up a giant territory. Several dozen tons of garbage were sent there every day. The searches could take months, and cost a huge amount. At the same time, the detectives were not even sure if they would ever find Tynesha's remains. However, the real horror was different. It was far from the whole story because Timothy missed significant details. He would never have confessed if the investigators themselves had not gotten to the bottom of it. The police immediately believed that Shepard did not tell the whole truth because they returned to his apartment and searched the balcony again carefully. What the experts found was truly terrifying. They checked the drain in the bathroom and in the kitchen, the gap between the halves on the balcony and the trash can. As a result, a bunch of burnt hair, tiny fragments of charred bones, fragments of teeth, and burnt skin were found. All this was sent for DNA testing, and now all that remained was to wait for the results. Apparently, after the murder, Timothy put Tynesha's body in the bathroom, cut it into several pieces, and then tried to get rid of the evidence. He burned some of the remains on the grill and then threw the ashes into the garbage. He destroyed other body fragments using a kitchen waste shredder. He scattered everything else in different garbage containers. Shepard was busy destroying the body of his former girlfriend for 2 or 3 days. He took advantage of the fact that he had 2 barbecue grills on the balcony and decided that the burnt bones would be more difficult to identify or associate with him. Looking back, the pieces of meat lying in the bathtub in a pile of ice, found by firefighters when inspecting the apartment, were nothing more than parts of Tynesha's body. Of course, at that moment, the rescuer could not even imagine that there were human remains in front of him. Meanwhile, a DNA test showed that the body fragments really belonged to 19-year-old Tynesha Stewart. Timothy Shepard was held in prison for $250,000 bail. The girl's mother, having learned that this man had done this to her daughter, wanted him to be tried to the full extent of the law. The prosecutor was also determined to achieve Shepard's conviction, but the whole case against Timothy almost fell apart because of his lawyer. Chip Lewis, a very successful lawyer known for his high-profile cases, including the infamous story where the criminal first took a life and then dismembered his neighbor. At that time, Lewis managed to succeed, proving that dismemberment is not equivalent to murder. Now Lewis was going to dispute every piece of evidence against Shepard that the prosecution team had. He focused on the fact that Timothy's confession was coerced. The lawyer argued that it was allegedly obtained under duress and that the detectives did not follow legal procedures. If the lawyer had been able to defend his position, then all the evidence found in apartment 224 would not have been possible to present in court. This would have made it much more difficult to issue an indictment. Fortunately, the prosecutor was able to convince the judge, and he rejected the request of the defense team. The trial of 28-year-old Timothy Wayne Shepard began on September 29, 2008, when the prosecutor laid out the details of the crime to the public present at the hearings. And the Tynesha family had to experience terrible moments, imagining in detail what was done to their daughter and sister. The defense team focused on the fact that Timothy strangled the girl as a result of self-defense, and what happened to her body was no longer so important. The lawyer tried to minimize the effect of the barbaric and inhuman actions of his client, and about the shards of a tooth found in Shepard's apartment, he stated that people sometimes lose their teeth, assuming that Tynesha accidentally dropped it into the sink before her death. It sounded wild, but this is the work of a lawyer. In response to such a statement, the prosecutor made a clarification that Timothy was afraid that he would be accused on the basis of a dental record, so he used pliers to pull out Tynesha's teeth. This is exactly what the expertise confirmed. As a witness, the public activist Quennell X also spoke. He promised the family of the deceased girl to seek justice and kept his word, giving evidence for everything he saw and heard. After 4 days of discussion, the jury recognized Timothy Shepard guilty of murdering his ex-girlfriend. The family and friends of Tynesha broke down, and Timothy sat indifferent and emotionless, like a monster, which, in principle, he was. When it came to the verdict, Shepard decided to make a statement. He wanted to get sympathy from the court. Although the lawyer dissuaded him from an unthinkable step, Timothy thought he could convince everyone that he did not deserve such a severe punishment. He would like to return home to his ordinary life and not waste the best years of his life behind bars. Naturally, his speech did not even cause pity. Timothy Shepard was sentenced to 99 years in prison and a maximum possible fine of $10,000. It would seem that justice had triumphed. Tanisha's mother blamed herself for everything. She did not see this evil in Shepard, which was hidden inside. She let this evil into her house and allowed it to be with her daughter, having no idea what this person was capable of. After the death of her daughter, Gail strives to ensure that other women do not suffer at the hands of their ex-partners. She shares Tanisha's story and holds discussions about healthy relationships. Gail believes that interfering in the affairs of her child is not a crime, but on the contrary, the duty of every parent who values the well-being of their daughter or son. If you have finished watching, you are a real fan of true crime. Subscribe to the channel, turn on the bell notifications, and put the like. See you in the next video. A cage is a device created by humans to contain an animal, to prevent its escape. The animal is inside the cage, the human outside. But what happens when the roles are reversed? In today's story, a human was the one caged, while those who locked the victim inside revealed themselves as true animals. And before we get started, be kind enough to support my channel. Subscribe to the channel, like the video, and stay active. It will help a lot. I will be very grateful to you for that. Let's get started. Today, we travel to the remote corners of Missouri to unravel an incredibly complex case. In 2021, a woman named Cassidy Rainwater, a mother of 6, went missing there. Her loved ones felt as though she had vanished into thin air or disappeared from the face of the earth. A few weeks later, deeply disturbing images surfaced on the dark web. A half-naked Cassidy was chained inside a locked cage in the middle of a forest. The woman appeared to have been tortured. Her haunted gaze hinted at unbearable torment. The photographs were so horrifying that they made one wonder if they were some kind of gruesome hoax. The police investigation lifted the veil on 2 monsters living in that forest. A whole network of crimes was uncovered, but some questions remain unanswered to this day. Cassidy Rainwater was born on June 9, 1988, meaning she was 33 years old in 2021. She grew up in Lebanon, Missouri with her parents, Clifford and Tracy, and her 3 brothers and sister. Cassidy was described as a cheerful and very outgoing person. From a young age, she had a passion for poetry and singing. Rainwater called herself a typical country girl. She met the father of her first child, Ben, in high school. Right after graduation, she became pregnant. Their relationship was far from happy, so the young couple soon parted ways. At 17, Cassidy sued Ben to enforce child support payments, which he complied with. But soon, the young woman decided it wasn't the right time for her to become a mother and gave the child up for adoption. About a year later, tragedy struck Cassidy's family. Her mother, Tracy, vanished without a trace. No one knew what had happened to her, and later, her daughter would share her mother's fate. Tracy had a hobby of collecting arrowheads in a nearby field. One day in April 2007, she went out, as usual, to search for her artifacts and disappeared. The family lived in uncertainty for a whole year, not knowing what had happened. Unfortunately, the police were unable to help at the time. In May 2008, a farmer spreading fertilizer in a neighboring field stumbled upon a pair of shoes and human bones. It was later determined that the remains belonged to Cassidy's mother. Tracy's death was now confirmed, dealing a devastating blow to her daughter. The mystery surrounding Tracy's disappearance and death was highly suspicious. It was strange that the woman couldn't be found for a year. If the police had searched more diligently and simply done their job, she likely would have been found much sooner. But Tracy's fate remains a mystery to this day, and no one knows what really happened to her. After this tragedy, Cassidy managed to pull herself out of depression. Over the next decade, she gave birth to 5 more children, all from different fathers. The woman's life was often unstable, but she loved her children more than anything in the world and was willing to do everything in her power for them. Later, Cassidy married a man named Zachary, the father of one of her children. They were wed in a local church. However, by 2021, the couple had separated and were living apart. Cassidy found herself in a difficult situation, as raising 5 children on her own was no easy task. She tried to manage parenting, but money was desperately scarce. In early 2021, Cassidy met a man named James Phelps and began visiting his cabin in the woods more frequently. Then, in July 2021, Cassidy vanished, just as her mother had years before. James Phelps was born in 1963 in the small town of Urbana, Missouri, with a population of just 400 people. The area was far from the hustle and bustle of city life and surrounded by forests. Children spent most of their time outdoors, as there were simply no other activities available. James attended the local high school and was listed among the top students. After graduating, he enlisted in the Army. Phelps married at the age of 30 and moved to St. Louis with his wife. In 2010, James's mother passed away, and he had to return to his hometown. He inherited his parents' house, but by then, his marriage had fallen apart. In 2019, James Phelps turned 56. He became an ordained minister in the Universal Life Church. After receiving his ordination, the man settled in a remote area outside Lebanon. His home was far off the beaten path. The location of the residence couldn't even be found on maps, as it was just an ordinary forest cabin. There were no neighbors around, no prying eyes. No one would see what the owner did in his free time. The road to James's property in the woods passed through a field full of abandoned cars. Vehicles of various makes had been sitting there for at least a decade. They were slowly rusting and becoming overgrown with grass and bushes. The place where Phelps lived seemed wild, eerie, like a scene from a horror movie, and utterly abandoned. In 2019, another person lived in the house besides James Phelps. His name was Timothy Norton. Timothy was born in 1965. He grew up in the same small town as James. They attended the same high school and were friends despite a slight age difference. After high school, Norton joined the Marine Corps, following James's example. At 23, Timothy married a 17-year-old girl who was still in high school. After leaving the service, he didn't know what to do with himself and began committing petty crimes. In the 1990s, he was convicted of assault. One day, Timothy came up with the brilliant idea of pouring gasoline on grass to start a forest fire. It's unclear what motivated him, but this foolish plan backfired. The gasoline canister he was holding caught fire and exploded, landing Norton in the hospital with 2nd and 3rd degree burns. Karma at work in real time, you might say. After this, Timothy's life spiraled further downward. He divorced, then remarried another woman, and went off the deep end. The man completely neglected personal hygiene, stopping showers altogether, which was evident from his greasy, unwashed long hair. He also had a strange habit of wearing military boots 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. He even slept in them. As a result, his body emitted a genuine stench. The trailer where he lived resembled a dump. Every inch of the floor was literally covered in dog feces. Around this time, Timothy became heavily involved with illegal substances and began cheating on his wife left and right. Astonishingly, there were women willing to share a bed with this man. One day, his wife came home and caught him with a lover in their marital bed. This led to a second divorce. When Timothy was in his 50s, he moved in with his childhood friend James Fee in his creepy forest house. It was in this hidden place, away from prying eyes, that the tragedy unfolded. In 2021, when James was 58 and Timothy was 56, they became engrossed in exploring the dark web. The dark web is a hidden segment of the internet, inaccessible through common search engines. Its defining feature is multi-layered data encryption and user anonymity. Tracking activities in this network is nearly impossible. As a result, it's rife with content unacceptable to most people. It's a haven for hackers and all sorts of scammers. Timothy and James spent hours on the dark web, browsing all kinds of dubious websites with deeply disturbing content. They also joined online communities and forums, creating new aliases for themselves. The friends were primarily interested in adult content, most of which was filmed without the participants' consent. They were both drawn to scenes involving cruelty and aggression. They also enjoyed watching obscene images and videos involving minors. The dark web is full of perverts ready to supply such content. The friends downloaded certain videos to their hard drive to rewatch them whenever they wanted. It's worth noting that James Phelps was a church minister. He created a profile on an adult website, listing some of his interests, such as bondage, spanking, beatings, and role-playing. Phelps wrote in his profile that he was looking for a good girl to be his maid and live with him. In essence, he was searching for a slave. Apparently, there were no takers. At the same time, other people with criminal records for sex offenses occasionally stayed at this creepy forest house alongside James and Timothy. This was the kind of company the two friends kept. James and Timothy grew so close that they called themselves brothers. Their behavior, especially on the dark web, was already incredibly disturbing, perverse, and illegal. But things only got worse. After watching countless videos, the friends decided to stop at dark fantasies and turn them into reality. Their main fantasy was to have a woman at their disposal, someone who would obey their every command and do whatever they desired. So James and Timothy began devising a plan to lure a stranger into their eerie forest cabin. They literally held brainstorming sessions to figure out how to do it. The men agreed they needed someone vulnerable, like a teenager, who would be easier to deceive. The conspirators even settled on an age range, someone between 12 and 14 years old. Then it dawned on them that kidnapping a minor would attract too much attention and could create unnecessary problems. So it wasn't the best idea. Instead of a teenager, the friends decided to abduct a woman they found appealing. James and Timothy first turned to social media. They browsed profiles of women from their town, selecting potential targets based on photos. Then they went to the local supermarket, hanging out in the store, eyeing female shoppers and choosing whom to kidnap. But both approaches failed. Soon, an opportunity fell into James's lap when he befriended a woman named Cassidy Rainwater. From that moment, her fate was sealed. It's unclear what kind of relationship connected the mother of many children and the man living in the woods. But it's believed that Cassidy, unable to afford housing, temporarily left her children with relatives and moved into James's cabin. For Phelps and Norton, this was the fulfillment of their desires, as they were specifically looking for a vulnerable young woman. And Rainwater fit the role perfectly. Supposedly taking pity on the mother of many, James invited Cassidy to live in his house. And then she vanished. No one heard from her or saw her. At first, the woman's family didn't pay much attention to Cassidy's lack of communication. They thought she might have gone somewhere to earn money. It took a month for relatives to grow concerned. In the past, even if Cassidy dropped off the radar for a short time, she never stopped communicating with her children and never made her family worry about her. On August 25, 2021, Cassidy's aunt, a woman named Cora, who was the guardian of one of her children, called the police and reported her niece's disappearance. What happened to the mother of 6? Where could she have gone for so long? At some point, James Phelps and Timothy Norton decided to bring their fantasies to life. They kidnapped Cassidy and locked her in a large metal cage on the grounds of the forest cabin. It's believed the cage was custom-made in advance, as the two friends had long been planning to abduct a woman. It's unknown how long they kept Cassidy in that cage. The men came up with the sick idea of photographing their captive. They tore off her clothes, and while one abused her in various ways, the other captured it all on camera to later post the images on their dark web page. The photos showed Cassidy with visible injuries. She looked terrified, and her condition was dire. James and Timothy were part of various dark web communities. There, they not only shared photos, but also described in detail what they did to their captive. While the friends had previously been content with watching adult videos, they now began creating their own. Some of the photos suggested that the men took turns assaulting Cassidy, locked in the metal cage. She was likely let out of the cage at times, as Phelps and Norton primarily dreamed of having a maid who would follow their orders. Then they would put her back in the cage, like a wild animal. In truth, this story raises many unanswered questions. It's unknown what other horrific things happened to Cassidy while she was at the mercy of the two monsters living in the woods. After all, besides James and Timothy, other criminals occasionally showed up at the cabin, and they could very well have joined the two friends. Let's return to August 25th, 2021, when Cassidy's aunt, Cora, reported her niece's disappearance to the police. Law enforcement officers asked the woman who Cassidy had been in contact with before vanishing. Cora mentioned the name James Phelps. She had seen Rainwater get into James's silver pickup truck on July 25th. That was the last time she saw her niece alive. The police headed to the creepy cabin in the dense forest to speak with its owner. When the officers knocked on the door, Phelps appeared immediately. He acted as if he had nothing to hide. The man politely answered all the detectives' questions and was quite forthcoming. When the officers asked about Cassidy, James confirmed that Rainwater had indeed stayed with him for a couple of weeks, until she got back on her feet. But on July 25th, she packed up in the middle of the night, got into a car parked on the cabin's property, and drove off. Apparently, she was headed to Colorado, as she had mentioned something about the state earlier. So James had no idea where Cassidy was now. He hadn't seen her since that night. At the time, the police had no evidence that Phelps was lying. They gave the property a cursory glance, but finding no trace of the missing woman, the officers thanked James for his time and left. It seems the police didn't notice the metal cage on the property. Otherwise, they might have had some questions. For a week, law enforcement scoured the area but found nothing. Thus, James and Timothy managed to conceal Cassidy's abduction. Days passed with no progress in the case. The investigation into the woman's disappearance hit a dead end before it even began. The detectives had no leads. It's entirely possible that the two monsters living in the woods could have easily escaped punishment for their crime. But then, everything changed. On September 16th, 2021, the FBI received an anonymous tip about images on the dark web of a half-naked woman in chains. She was being held in a large metal cage attached to a mechanical hoist used by hunters to gut game. The FBI immediately investigated these images. First, agents verified the authenticity of the photos. They were real, not manipulated. Next, they needed to identify the woman in the photos. Experts reviewed databases of missing persons, estimated the possible time and place the photos were taken, and tried to piece it all together. Miraculously, the FBI came across Rainwater's case. They compared photos of women and realized that Cassidy was the very captive in the metal cage depicted in the dark web images. The FBI contacted the local sheriff's office and reported the discovery. The police realized they needed to search James's property again, as it was determined that the images matched the backyard of his property. They immediately obtained a warrant to search the house and the owner's electronic devices. Detectives arriving at the scene promptly seized James's cell phone and immediately found about a dozen images of Cassidy Rainwater, the very ones circulating on the dark web. This was more than enough to arrest James on the spot, and he was promptly handcuffed. But the disturbing discoveries didn't end there. Things only got worse. During a thorough search of the property, police found meat hooks hanging from the ceiling, with a large freezer standing in the center of the room beneath them. The officers were horrified at what they might find inside. They opened the freezer, and their worst fears were confirmed. Inside were several packages containing possible human remains, each labeled with a freezing date and body part. One of them was dated July 24th. Some remains were even vacuum sealed. Someone had clearly put significant effort into preparing them. When officers asked James if these were indeed human remains, as indicated on the packages, Phelps smirked and said he had actually treated a neighbor to barbecued human ribs the day before. At that moment, The officers were so shocked and repulsed that they didn't know how to react. Despite all these insane discoveries, they still held a faint hope of finding Cassidy alive. The contents of the freezer weren't yet proof that the woman was dead. Besides, they first needed to confirm that the remains were indeed human. The freezer's contents were immediately sent for analysis, while detectives tried to get the cabin's owner to reveal where Cassidy Rainwater had really gone. However, James refused to confirm or deny anything. He didn't assist the investigation at all. So they decided to talk to Norton, who lived in the forest cabin with Phelps. He was arrested and brought in for questioning at the sheriff's office, but Timothy also refused to comment. The police were left waiting for the results of the DNA testing of the suspected human remains, which could take up to 30 days. They still had no idea what had happened or where Cassidy was. The arrest of the two men on kidnapping charges, followed by the sheriff's office refusing to provide more details due to the extreme nature of the crime, sparked a wave of speculation online. As a result, law enforcement refused to comment on the case's details and condemned both bloggers and local journalists. Rumors about the case spread like wildfire in the local community and on social media. The media published news about the discovery of possible human remains found in the forest house where James and Timothy lived. This was the only information the police made public. Rumors that Phelps and Norton were serial killers spread rapidly through the town. This wasn't surprising, given how meticulously the remains were packaged and how carefully the body had been dismembered. It gave the impression that these two had significant experience and had likely done this before. The public's main theory was that the men lured women to their cabin, tortured them in the metal cage, posted images on the dark web, then killed them and sold the meat. While this sounds implausible, it at least explains the vacuum packaging and labeling. One person living nearby even claimed to have found human skin hanging from a tree, further fueling rumors about the killer friends. It got to the point where people linked Norton and Phelps to a criminal organization involved in exterminating women. This theory had some basis, as mentioned earlier, several individuals with prior convictions for sex crimes were registered at the forest cabin besides the two friends. The small town where this horrific crime took place buzzed like a beehive. These were just rumors, but they could all be true. Unfortunately, many questions in this case remain unanswered. The local sheriff was furious. He didn't want people discussing unconfirmed theories and called them fake news. He particularly criticized TikTok bloggers making videos about the case. The sheriff said, quite rightly, that it's not a good idea to listen to the opinions of young people sitting in their parents' apartments, munching chips, sipping soda, and dreaming of becoming social media superstars by spreading their speculations. He absolutely despised armchair detectives. 2 weeks after the discovery of human remains in James Phelps's house, both men were still in custody, and the DNA analysis results were still pending when a major development occurred in the case. The creepy forest cabin burned to the ground. The fire started suddenly in the middle of the night. Many pieces of evidence that hadn't been collected initially were still inside. Authorities couldn't understand how the fire started and launched an investigation. Experts determined it was arson. During the investigation, they found a tripwire connected to an explosive device in the house. Just to be safe, they called in a bomb squad to ensure the device was neutralized. Someone had deliberately planted the explosive to accelerate the fire. Since James and Timothy were in custody, they clearly weren't involved, but they likely asked someone to set the house on fire. The blaze at the forest cabin further fueled rumors that a criminal gang was operating in the area. Could these people have been connected to Cassidy's disappearance? What were they trying to hide by burning the house to the ground? What evidence might have been left inside that they rushed to destroy? Questions multiplied by the day. All this time, Cassidy's family held on to hope that she was alive. They prayed she would reach out. Sadly, that didn't happen, as in November 2021, 6 weeks after James and Timothy's arrest, relatives received devastating news that the human remains found in the freezer belonged to Cassidy Rainwater. Additionally, over 200 pieces of evidence related to the missing woman, such as blood traces and other DNA samples, were found in the house before the fire. Authorities had to inform Cassidy's family that she had passed away at 33, leaving behind 6 children. Initially, James and Timothy were charged only with kidnapping, but now a murder charge was added. Police interrogated them even more intensely, determined to extract a confession. Finally, the pressure paid off. Timothy Norton broke and revealed what really happened to Cassidy. One summer evening, James approached Timothy, who was sleeping in his truck. Phelps tapped on the window and told his friend he needed help because it was time to deal with Cassidy. The woman was sleeping in the house at the time, unaware of anything. The day before, they had let her out of the cage and allowed her to rest a bit. The men returned to the house. James approached the sleeping Cassidy and, wrapping his hands around her neck, began to strangle her. He asked his friend to hold the captive down until she stopped moving. Timothy pinned Cassidy's legs while James squeezed her throat. Then Phelps put a plastic bag over the victim's head to suffocate Rainwater. The odds were against her, and Cassidy, sadly, died. Though Timothy confessed how they took their captive's life, neither he nor James went into detail about what they did to Cassidy before depriving her of air. So it's still unknown what tortures and horrors the woman endured, locked in a metal cage in the middle of the forest. When Cassidy was dead, James asked Timothy to help carry the body outside and tie it to a nearby metal structure. That's when Phelps began the gruesome process of dismembering and removing all internal organs. It was horrific. Blood was everywhere. Judging by his expression, Timothy was shocked by what his friend was doing, but he did nothing to stop James. After finishing the organ removal, Phelps cut the flesh into small pieces and asked Norton to take the body parts to the bathtub. Norton did everything. He never said no to his friend. Over the next few days, James processed what was left of Cassidy, sealed vacuum packages, labeled them, and placed the remains in the freezer, which the police later discovered. All this came from Timothy Norton's account, but he didn't come across as a reliable or honest person either, so one can only guess how it really happened. After this confession, Timothy and James were set to face trial to answer for their atrocities. Initially, both men pleaded not guilty, so the trial was long and drawn out, but in the end, they both changed their stance. Clearly, the friends realized they had no chance of winning the case and that they could face the death penalty if they went to trial with a jury. In 2023, James Phelps entered an Alford plea. An Alford plea, or doctrine, is a type of plea deal practiced in the U.S. Under it, the defendant acknowledges the inability to refute the charges against them and the legal validity of a guilty verdict but maintains their innocence. Under an Alford plea, a defendant may plead guilty not because they committed the crime, but because the prosecution has enough evidence. In essence, the defendant agrees with the charges and may receive a lighter sentence while not admitting guilt. Meanwhile, Timothy Norton also pleaded guilty. Since both defendants took plea deals, they avoided the death penalty. Instead, they were sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. In the end, Cassidy Rainwater's family had to wait 3 long years to have her remains returned, so they could finally bury her. This was the last wish of her children for their mother. They wanted to lay her to rest so they would have a place to visit, cry, and talk to the closest person in their lives. Losing their mother at such a young age, Cassidy's daughters and sons endured unimaginable emotional pain. The youngest girl had to see a psychologist, as she suffered from nightmares long after her mother's death. When some details of Cassidy's death became known, older children were bullied at school, teased, and humiliated in every way. Nevertheless, Cassidy's heirs remember their mother as the most wonderful person on earth, a hard-working and affectionate woman, and they are proud of her no matter what. At the funeral, the eldest son said that his mom tried so hard for them and gave them the best life she could. Cassidy Rainwater was not just a name in the news, not just a topic for newspaper discussions. She was real, a person loved by many. Cassidy lived the best she could. Because Phelps and Norton took a plea deal, there was no trial. As a result, many facts and pieces of evidence in this case were never made public. If the criminals hadn't posted images of their captive on the dark web, they might have escaped accountability altogether. The only comforting thought is that the beings who called themselves humans but acted like true animals ended up where they belong, behind bars in a prison cell. If you have finished watching, you are a real fan of true crime. Subscribe to the channel, turn on the bell notifications, and put the like. See you in the next video. This story can be described in many ways: a theater of the absurd, a tangled plot of a love drama, or the script of a senseless crime. Rivalry over a man rarely leads to anything good. This is exactly what the participants in this story eventually realized when their lives changed overnight, and for some, simply ended absurdly. And before we get started, be kind enough to support my channel. Subscribe to the channel, like the video, and stay active. It will help a lot. I will be very grateful to you for that. Let's get started. Emilia Carr was born on August 4th, 1984. She grew up in the city of McIntosh, Florida, where she lived with her parents, 2 older brothers, and younger sister. Emilia had far from an ideal childhood. From an early age, the girl was subjected to abuse by her own father and grandfather, the very people who were supposed to protect her and ensure her safety. When the authorities learned about the investigation involving minors, all 4 children were removed from the family. Emilia's father was arrested and held accountable. The man was ordered to complete a court-mandated program. For some reason, he was not sent to prison, as they believed he would reform after the program. But then, the children were returned to the family where they were abused, and everything resumed. This went on throughout Emilia's childhood and teenage years. The authorities turned a blind eye, believing her father had changed. Worst of all, the girl's mother also ignored what was happening, even though she clearly saw how her daughter suffered. She knew but did nothing. Emilia described the horror she felt almost every night when she went to bed. As soon as she heard the creak of floorboards outside her room, she knew her father or grandfather would abuse her again. At school, Emilia pretended everything was fine at home. She focused on her studies to achieve something in life and truly excelled. Her IQ was 125. Emilia was an excellent student and believed a good education would help her change her situation. When she turned 15, the abuse was still ongoing. But now Emilia began to fear for her younger sister, Milagro, who was 13 at the time. She suspected that Milagro was also being abused. The sisters were incredibly close. The younger girl was born with several congenital defects, and Emilia felt obligated to protect her. But what could a schoolgirl do against 2 grown men? The girl went to the school administrator and told them everything that was happening at home. As soon as the teachers learned about the abuse in the family, her father was immediately arrested. This time, he was actually charged and was set to appear in court. Emilia, her mother, and maternal grandmother were ready to testify in court. Instead of admitting guilt and trying to fix the situation, Emilia's father decided to take action. He wasn't going to spend time in prison and hired a hitman to get rid of his wife, mother-in-law, and eldest daughter all at once. But apparently, he was in such a hurry to deal with his family that he approached the wrong person. It turned out the hitman he hired was an undercover police officer. Despite the fact that Emilia's father had abused his eldest daughter for 10 years, possibly molested the younger one, and then hired a hitman to eliminate his family members, he was sentenced to only 4 years in prison. However, this time was enough for Emilia to get back on her feet and breathe freely. She was finally able to escape the abuse and protect her younger sister from it. For the first time in her life, things were going well for the girl. She became passionate about photography, started working in modeling, and enlisted in the military. Unfortunately, her difficult childhood left a mark on Emilia, as she had endured too much. On one hand, she felt guilty for sending her own father to prison. On the other, she was incredibly angry at her mother for allowing her husband to abuse the children, for not intervening or protecting them. The girl was torn by conflicting emotions and had to cope with them somehow. Eventually, Emilia left her mother's home and lived in various foster families. Then she dropped out of school and, at 17, became pregnant. The father of the child was a man much older than her. To avoid legal trouble for him, Emilia married him. The marriage was doomed from the start, and the couple soon divorced. After that, the young woman changed partners like gloves, constantly entering relationships that weren't right for her. As a result, she had 2 more children with 2 different men. Then Emilia periodically got involved in criminal activities. She even had a conviction for helping her ex-husband steal exotic birds. By the age of 21, Emilia was a single mother with 3 children. She realized she was on the wrong path and decided to turn her life around, to settle down somehow. So she earned her high school diploma, trained as a massage therapist, and began earning a decent living. It was at this stage of her life that Emilia met a couple who played a significant role in this story: Joshua Fulgham and Heather Strong. They were about 3 years older than Emilia and had been in a relationship for quite a long time. Their romance began back in high school. Joshua Fulgham was born on August 16, 1981 in Mississippi, and like Emilia, he had a very troubled childhood. When the boy was about 7, his mother brought home a new partner who constantly beat Josh. The boy was always covered in bruises and suffered several head injuries, which caused him to repeat grades multiple times before being expelled from school altogether. The closest person to Joshua was his grandmother. She understood him like no one else, and did everything she could to ease her grandson's suffering. Unfortunately, when Fulgham was a teenager, his grandmother passed away. The boy was left alone with his problems. This was the final straw for him. After the elderly woman's funeral, Josh's life seemed to spiral completely out of control. He turned to alcohol and illegal drugs to cope with the situation and eventually became a criminal. Fulgham committed arson and burglaries, and one day he was caught. At 16, Josh ended up in juvenile detention centers multiple times. Once, after being released, he met a girl named Heather Strong. Heather was his age, but very kind and gentle. Her face always lit up with a smile. She knew how to offer support and care. At the time, 16-year-old Heather worked as a waitress. When they met at a cafe, the young people instantly felt drawn to each other. It was their first teenage love. When a family member attacked Heather at home, Josh and his mother opened their home to her. That's how the couple began living together. At 18, Heather became pregnant with Josh's child, and their first son was born. The young father settled down and got a job in trailer construction and installation. They could now afford to move out and live on their own. It seemed a bright future awaited them. However, soon, Joshua fell back into using illegal substances, and his life went downhill. His entire world turned into chaos. He lost his job. Their means of survival ran out quickly. To fund his destructive addiction, Fulgham turned to selling illegal drugs, and since that money wasn't enough, he decided to produce psychoactive substances himself. His drug addiction completely changed Josh's personality, turning him into an angry, volatile, and highly aggressive person. Soon, he began physically abusing Heather, seeing other women behind her back, and acting erratically. The young woman didn't want her child to grow up in constant fear. She packed her things and moved with the baby to her grandmother's house. This happened repeatedly. Heather would leave, Josh would pull himself together, clean up the house, and go retrieve the mother of his child. He would beg her on his knees to return to him, assuring her he was done with drugs and that things would be different from now on. But people rarely change. As soon as Heather believed him and returned, the cycle would repeat after some time. It was during this period, when the couple was constantly breaking up and getting back together, that Heather became pregnant again. They decided their life was too unstable to have another child. So when Heather gave birth, the couple decided it would be best for the baby to be given up for adoption, which is what happened. This difficult decision became a point of no return for Josh. He finally realized he needed to get his act together, or one day he would lose everything he had. In 2003, 21-year-old Heather and Josh tried to start over. They moved from Mississippi to Marion County, Florida, where Josh's other grandmother lived, who helped them get back on their feet. Everything was going well until the couple met a young woman named Amelia Carr, and then everything went downhill again, especially for Heather. At the time, Amelia was dating a man named Jamie Akeem. They had been friends since school, and he was also the father of one of her children. Their relationship was complicated, with the young couple constantly breaking up and getting back together. When Josh and Heather moved to Florida, the two couples met and started spending a lot of time together. Soon after the move, Heather became pregnant again. This was her third child. Unfortunately, instead of becoming a loving and caring father, Josh relapsed and returned to his destructive habits. He became excessively aggressive. Fulgham was angered that Heather, due to her pregnancy, refused intimacy, and he began cheating on her again. Somehow, Amelia and Josh went from being friends to lovers. A mutual friend of theirs died in a car accident. They were completely devastated by the news. To console each other, they couldn't think of anything better than to sleep together. From that moment, their affair began. At the time, Amelia and Jamie Akeem were on a break, so Carr's boyfriend had no idea, and the lovers met almost every day. But pregnant Heather had no clue their relationship was more than just friendship. When Strong gave birth, all the childcare responsibilities fell on her shoulders. Josh found it far more entertaining to spend time with Amelia than to care for the baby. This affair lasted nearly a year when Heather finally discovered that her beloved and Amelia, who called herself a friend, were secretly involved. She was utterly devastated. The woman packed her things, took the children, and returned to Mississippi. As the saying goes, you don't value what you have until it's gone. That's exactly how Joshua felt when he realized he had lost his partner yet again. Only then did he realize that he truly needed only Heather. Amelia Carr was just a way to satisfy his male needs. Joshua was never in love with her. Fulgham simply thought the grass was always greener on the other side. After thinking it over, he ended things with Amelia and, 2 weeks later, went to Mississippi to win back his beloved. He swore up and down that he would never look at another woman, that he couldn't be happy without Heather, and that he would carry her in his arms and do everything to make her and the children happy. The woman melted again and believed Josh. This marked the beginning of an endless, tangled love triangle. Heather and Josh lived in Mississippi for a while. 5 months passed since their reunion, and everything was wonderful until they decided to return to Florida. Although Josh loved Heather, there was something about Amelia Carr that wouldn't let him go. Unfortunately, moving back to Marion County brought everything back to square one. Fulgham almost immediately started drinking and using illegal substances again, becoming aggressive once more. His behavior led to constant arguments and family disputes. After yet another breakup, Josh ran back to Amelia and found solace in his mistress's bed. However, this situation didn't sit well with Heather, and now she wanted to bring Fulgham back into the family. This went on for months. Josh would leave one woman for the other, then return, until all the players in this romance finally entered a polyamorous relationship. Polyamorous relationships are an ethical view of love that allows one person to have romantic relationships with multiple people simultaneously with their consent. There were even rumors that Heather and Amelia were also in a relationship with each other. But in the end, each woman dreamed of being the only one for Josh. Neither was satisfied with the arrangement. Both tolerated the situation out of fear of losing the man they loved. By June 2008, Heather had had enough. She turned 26 and didn't want to spend her entire life competing for Josh's heart. She decided to break up, this time for good. Previously, Heather had worked part-time as a nanny. She looked after the children of a single man named Ben. After breaking up with Fulgham, she quickly started a romance with Ben. Their children were about the same age. Heather liked Ben's calm demeanor. At first, they were just friends. But after the woman ended things with Josh, their relationship turned romantic. Finally, Heather could enjoy life, coming home to someone who was waiting for her, who treated her with deep respect. Their children got along quickly, and everything would have been fine if not for one problem. That problem was Josh. It turned out the man wasn't going to let Heather be happy without him. At first, he couldn't believe she would actually leave him and start living her own life. But when he realized it, he became literally obsessed with Heather and Ben's relationship. Josh began stalking them both, driving by Ben's house at night, waiting for them on the street, and even threatening violence if they didn't break up. One day, he broke into Ben's house armed with a gun, demanding they end their relationship. Meanwhile, Josh was still living with Amelia, who didn't seem to care that her boyfriend was obsessed with his ex. Or she was willing to tolerate Fulgham's behavior as long as he stayed with her. November 2008 arrived, and Heather and Ben had been in a serious, stable relationship for about 5 months. Everything was wonderful. They were both happy. Joshua and Amelia were also living together. That summer, Carr became pregnant, and in November, when she was about 4 months along, Fulgham proposed to her. The news of the engagement quickly reached Heather Strong, and her good mood vanished. She had borne Josh 3 children, stood by him through the toughest times, endured his unbearable behavior, and yet another woman received the proposal. This fact deeply hurt Heather. It pained her. Nevertheless, she began reevaluating her relationship with Ben and concluded that she was still in love with Joshua. After telling Ben she wanted to end things, Heather called Fulgham and said she wanted to reconcile. Naturally, between Carr and Strong, Josh always chose the latter. He immediately broke things off with the pregnant Amelia and asked her to return the engagement ring. A few days later, Fulgham proposed to Heather with the same ring. A month later, the newlyweds registered their marriage, officially exchanging vows. 10 minutes after the ceremony, Josh called Amelia for a friendly chat, and that was just the beginning. Within days of the wedding, the young couple began arguing. There was no honeymoon period. Things were so bad that a week and a half after the wedding, Josh pointed a shotgun at Heather's face and threatened to shoot her. The woman, terrified, called the police. Josh was arrested. He was charged with assault with a firearm under aggravating circumstances. He was sent to jail to await trial. At that moment, Heather sold her engagement ring, and while Josh was in jail, began dating a man named Jamie Akeem. He had appeared earlier in the story. Jamie was Amelia Carr's ex-boyfriend and the father of one of her children. He was also Fulgham's best friend when he and Heather first moved to Florida. They hung out as couples and often spent time together as a group of 4. During this time, Amelia visited Josh in jail. The man was furious at Heather for putting him behind bars, even though he was the one who threatened to shoot her with a shotgun. Fulgham was convinced his wife had deliberately set him up to ruin his life. Now he and Carr were together again, and Josh constantly vented his grievances about Heather to her. Wanting to be the only one, Amelia egged him on even more. Deep down, she wanted her rival gone from their lives forever. In Amelia's view, the only way to stay with Josh was to get rid of Heather Strong. Carr kept saying that if Heather wanted, Josh would lose his children. Something had to be done about it. Fulgham was already on edge in jail, and Amelia kept pressing his sore spots. At some point, it worked. Josh no longer wanted Heather. Now he wanted to be with Amelia alone. But he was in jail awaiting trial, and something needed to be done to make Heather drop the charges. The wildest part of this whole situation was that Carr and Strong were still on good terms. They weren't best friends, but they communicated normally. Amelia sometimes looked after Heather's children when she needed to step out, but she didn't know that Strong was dating one of her ex-boyfriends. Amelia would come to Heather's house and try to convince her to drop the charges against Josh. She tried to stay calm until she learned that Heather was dating Jamie Akeem, the father of one of her children. At that moment, everything changed because Amelia lost her temper. She grabbed a knife, held it to Heather's throat, and demanded that the woman drop the charges. Eventually, Amelia calmed down and pulled herself together. But at that moment, she harbored a serious grudge against her rival. Considering she herself was sleeping with Strong's husband, Amelia had no moral right to make any demands of Heather. Carr began going to all her acquaintances, friends, and relatives, offering them $500 to go to Heather's house and break her neck. Amelia was literally following in her own father's footsteps, who had hired a hitman to kill his family because they turned him into the police. It got to the point where Amelia went to Jamie and offered him money to kill his girlfriend. The people she approached with such a wild request thought it was a joke, and naturally, no one agreed. However, the information reached Heather and terrified her. The woman dropped the charges against Joshua. On February 6, 2009, after spending a month behind bars, Fulgham was released, and events took a tragic turn. Upon leaving jail, the man decided he urgently needed to see his children. He went to Heather's house, where he learned she was now dating Jamie, his best friend. Moreover, Jamie was now driving Josh's car. Fulgham was furious that his wife had replaced him so quickly. He yelled, cursed, and then declared he would take custody of their children away from Heather. She responded that he wouldn't see the children at all until he changed his behavior. The craziest part of this mess was that the children were the ones suffering. Heather and Josh had 2 children. Amelia had 3 children from different fathers and was pregnant with a 4th from Josh. Fulgham didn't even hear that all he needed to do was change his behavior. From his wife's words, he concluded that she was going to return to Mississippi and take the children with her so he could never see them again. Josh grew angrier, and Amelia kept pouring fuel on the fire, egging him on that Heather needed to pay dearly. 9 days after Fulgham was released from jail, Heather Strong disappeared. No one had the slightest idea where she could have gone. On February 15, 2009, Heather didn't show up for her shift as a waitress at a cafe at a gas station. She had never missed work before, and such behavior was out of character for her. Even more suspicious was that earlier that day, Strong called her boyfriend Jamie and, through tears, said that Josh was coming to pick up his children. Heather also said she would try to convince Fulgham to leave them alone. Jamie Akeem was used to the constant drama between the former spouses, so he didn't pay much attention to the call. But when he returned home from work that evening, neither Heather nor the children were there. Some of their belongings were also gone. Everything pointed to the woman having gone somewhere. Jamie tried calling Heather, but she didn't answer. Then he called Josh, and Fulgham told him that Heather had come back to him, and they were a family again. He asked Jamie not to bother them anymore. Jamie wasn't even surprised. He had long accepted that Heather and Josh would periodically get back together and break up, so he sadly let it go. 10 days passed since Heather disappeared. Fulgham told everyone that his wife had brought him the children and then left for Mississippi because she needed a break. But that didn't sound like Heather at all. People began to suspect something was wrong. Strong would never have left her children with Josh for such a long time because she didn't trust him. Gradually, the rumors reached Mississippi. Heather's family, where she had supposedly returned, was very surprised. They hadn't heard from her in almost 2 weeks. Then her relatives raised the alarm and reported Heather missing. The police immediately began an investigation. Josh was the first suspect, as the authorities were already aware of domestic violence in the family. The man told them the story that Heather had brought the children and then left for Mississippi to rest and gather her thoughts. Fulgham even showed the officers a document where the woman voluntarily transferred custody of the children to him. There were no grounds to charge Josh, but the police's suspicions didn't go away. On March 18th, just over a month after Strong's disappearance, the police received a report that cash had been withdrawn from Heather's bank card at an ATM. Detectives immediately checked the surveillance footage and discovered that Joshua Fulgham had used the missing woman's card. At that point, it was enough to arrest him. During the interrogation, the officers learned there was another key witness who played a role in Strong's disappearance: Amelia Carr. The woman voluntarily came to the station, expressing a desire to assist the investigation. She was very convincing and played the role of a concerned friend well. Amelia and Josh were questioned simultaneously, but in separate rooms. The officers wanted to get a confession from them. Soon, the police learned that Carr had offered acquaintances $500 to kill her best friend. They also found out that during one argument, the woman had held a knife to Strong's throat and threatened to kill her. After these details, Amelia visibly grew nervous, though she tried to appear calm outwardly and claimed she had no conflicts with anyone. Then the detectives began pitting Josh and Amelia against each other, telling both that one of them had already confessed but was trying to pin the crime on their accomplice. Amelia quickly realized she needed to save herself and declared she would tell the truth if granted immunity from prosecution. Of course, the detectives couldn't agree to this, as the woman was a potential criminal. They decided to press Josh harder, and he broke. The interrogations lasted several days and were exhausting, so Fulgham confessed that he didn't take Heather's life, but was still guilty. On February 15, 2009, the day Heather disappeared, Joshua snapped. He genuinely believed his wife would take his children and prevent him from seeing them. Much of this was due to Amelia, who constantly provoked him, and so the man decided something needed to be done to remove his ex-wife from the picture. First, they needed to lure Heather to Amelia's trailer. According to Josh, they promised her money. Strong brought the children to her husband's house and then somehow ended up at her rival's trailer. Inside, an argument broke out between the spouses, during which an enraged Amelia stormed in and hit Heather on the head with a flashlight. Strong lost consciousness. Seizing the moment, the conspirators sat her in a computer chair, bound her hands and feet with duct tape, and taped her mouth shut so she couldn't make a sound. When the captive came to, Josh showed her a document where she voluntarily transferred custody of the children to him and demanded she sign it. At first, Heather adamantly refused, so the man resorted to threatening her life. If Strong didn't voluntarily give up the children, Josh promised to kill her. He must not have been very convincing because Heather ultimately signed the document herself, and that should have been the end of the story, as Fulgham technically got what he wanted. But then Amelia stepped in and convinced Josh that letting Heather go was dangerous because she would find a way to get revenge. The only way to silence her was to get rid of her once and for all. And Joshua agreed with her. First, Amelia tried to break Heather's neck, relying on her skills as a massage therapist, but she simply didn't have the strength. Then she put a trash bag over her rival's head and wrapped duct tape around her neck to suffocate her. But that didn't work either. Finally, Amelia approached Heather and pinched her nose shut, cutting off her air supply. The victim's mouth was taped shut, so she had no way to breathe. For a while, Strong tried to resist, but soon her body went limp. After that, Josh and Amelia put the woman's body in a suitcase, and then, when no one was around, buried it in the backyard. Later, Fulgham led the detectives to the spot and showed them where his wife, Heather Strong's remains were hidden. Now, the police had Josh's confession, but Amelia still hadn't said anything. The detectives had no evidence proving her involvement in the crime and had no idea how to get the truth out of her. That's when Fulgham's sister, Michelle, stepped in. The woman came to the police station herself and said she could get a confession from Amelia Carr. Michelle didn't want her brother to be convicted for someone else's crime. The investigators arranged a meeting between Michelle and Amelia, equipping Josh's sister with a listening device beforehand. The women were friends, so a walk in the park together wasn't unusual for them. Michelle insisted that Carr tell her the truth, and Amelia, unaware that her friend was wearing a wire, fully corroborated Josh's story, describing how they tried various ways to kill Heather. The woman had no idea the detectives were listening to her entire account, That was essentially all the police needed. Emilia Carr and Joshua Fulgham were charged with kidnapping and first-degree murder. While in jail awaiting trial, Emilia gave birth to her fourth child, who was immediately given up for adoption. Her other 3 children, as well as Heather and Josh's 2 children, were placed in foster families. The irresponsible parents, unable to sort out their own lives and relationships, ruined the lives of several young children. 18 months later, in 2010, the case finally went to trial. Emilia Carr was the first to face the jury. She pleaded not guilty. The Carr family issued a statement that due to the abuse she suffered from her father and grandfather as a child, Emilia was traumatized, which could have affected her mental state. Her lawyer tried to portray the defendant as a victim under Joshua's strict control and influence, but the prosecution only needed to present the recording of her confession, and the young woman's false nature was immediately exposed. The jury found Emilia Carr guilty of first-degree murder. Next, they had to decide what punishment the defendant should face. The grand jury voted 7-5 to sentence Emilia to death. At the age of 24, Carr was placed on death row and became the youngest woman to receive such a severe verdict. She was officially sentenced to death by lethal injection on February 22, 2011. A year later, in April 2012, Josh's trial took place. He also pleaded not guilty. However, he was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole for the same crime, as the jury's opinions were divided. 8 voted for life imprisonment, while 4 voted against. The judge followed their recommendation. Although both defendants were guilty of kidnapping and Heather Strong's death, it was Emilia who took away her ability to breathe. Perhaps this fact played a key role in the sentencing. While in prison, Emilia launched a campaign to prove her innocence. She gave several interviews in which she again tried to portray herself as a victim of circumstances. The title of "The Youngest Woman on Death Row" was one Carr held for a long time. However, in 2017, after numerous appeals, her death sentence was commuted to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole, as the jury's initial vote was not unanimous. Often, in crimes, more attention is focused on women, but in this case, both perpetrators were guilty. The difference was that Josh genuinely repented and took responsibility for what he did. He deeply regretted taking the life of the mother of his children and the woman he once loved. But Emilia Carr continued to deny everything and blamed Josh. She never showed remorse, yet both were equally responsible. Fulgham was the force, and Carr was the one who directed that force as she pleased. Heather Strong was a kind, caring, and loving young woman. She had 2 children whom she loved more than anything in the world. Heather worked hard to provide them with everything they needed and wanted nothing more than to watch them grow. The worst part is that it wasn't just Heather who suffered. Her children lost both parents at once. Strong was only 26 years old, and her murder was utterly senseless. Heather's main problem was that she chose the wrong man. As the saying goes, love is blind. If you have finished watching, you are a real fan of true crime. Subscribe to the channel, turn on the bell notifications, and put the like. See you in the next video. The greatest dream of Nastya was to gain fame, to finally be noticed. And it seemed she was on her way to stardom, albeit not in the most conventional way. However, instead of enjoying a luxurious life, Nastya somehow decided to die. Or did someone make that decision for her? And before we get started, be kind enough to support my channel. Subscribe to the channel, like the video, and stay active. It will help a lot. I will be very grateful to you for that. Let's get started. Today's story took place in Russia in 2022. In one episode of a popular talk show, so many secrets and lies surfaced that a criminal was essentially exposed. 3 months after the episode aired, the show's star, an influencer named Nastya Kamlovskaya, an OnlyFans model, vanished from the radar but remained online. Yet many wondered, was it really Nastya? In the 2020s, it became common for influencers to transition into the adult industry. Many people started OnlyFans accounts, and even became famous thanks to their content on the platform. The OnlyFans platform began operating in 2016. Initially, its developers didn't expect it to be used for distributing adult content. However, that format sparked the most interest. The events took place in St. Petersburg, Russia's cultural capital, a city full of museums, galleries, theaters, and home to many prominent Russian artists. It's a place where people could push boundaries and experiment. This is where Nastya Kamlovskaya, better known to her friends as Nastya Grishman, was born. Nastya was born on February 7, 1996, and her childhood was incredibly tough. The poor girl faced hardships from the very beginning. Her father was an alcoholic and was barely present in her life. Nastya was an only child, raised by her mother, Elena, and frankly, their financial situation was dire. Mother and daughter shared a single bed in a tiny room in a dormitory until Nastya was 12 years old. She was a teenager, without personal space, or even her own bed. To somehow provide for herself and her child, Elena took her daughter to her mother-in-law in Kolpino and left to work in another city. The girl lived with her paternal grandmother. Although Nastya's father had no role in her upbringing, his mother took on that responsibility. In her grandmother's house, Anastasia finally had her own bedroom and some chance to be alone. But at the same time, she saw her mother less and less. At first, Elena tried to visit her daughter every weekend, but those visits soon dwindled. It seemed Elena had other priorities. Of course, her main task was work and money, like most people, because she and Nastya needed housing, food, and clothing. However, Elena's second priority became men. Sadly, Nastya herself slipped to third place. While Elena built her personal life, her daughter felt abandoned and unwanted. She felt pushed out of the new family her mother had built with another man. Nastya was deeply unhappy. Her father had abandoned her at an early age, and now her mother had grown distant. Depression followed the girl through nearly her entire conscious life. She grew up without proper attention or emotional support because her mother was constantly working. The lack of control over her own life continued to haunt Nastya into her teenage years and ultimately manifested in an eating disorder. The poor girl had to battle numerous problems. Thankfully, her grandmother eased the situation somewhat during that time. She supported and encouraged Nastya's love for art, something she had never experienced before. The woman provided her granddaughter with everything she needed for creativity: paints, pencils, canvases. By the age of 15, Nastya's love for art had grown so strong that she wanted to express it on her own body. She was still a few years away from adulthood, but her grandmother was lenient and personally took her to a tattoo parlor, where she got her first tattoo. That design on her skin marked the beginning of a lifelong pursuit, not just to create art, but to become a work of art herself, a tattoo artist. Now Nastya was that cool, rebellious teenager many dreamed of becoming but never could. At the same time, Kamlovskaya stood out from the crowd not only with her tattoos and unconventional appearance, but also with a wide range of skills. In college, she studied to become an auto mechanic and learned computer programming, painted pictures, and created striking looks. She was a multifaceted person, and by that time was already working part-time at a tattoo parlor as an apprentice. Nastya was doing what she loved, expressing her creative potential, and ultimately earning some money from it. So, Anastasia's style emerged in her teenage years, reflecting her inner world. She had a unique, very memorable appearance. She dyed her hair in various colors, wore piercings, and dressed boldly and provocatively. Her style could be described as a mix of anime and gothic. The girl adored Japanese animation and video games. At 16, Nastya created her first account on the social network VKontakte. In her posts, she shared her favorite hobbies, anime, games, and tattoos. Gradually, a community of sorts formed around her, a group of people genuinely interested in reading Nastya's updates. That's how she became an influencer, even before the term gained widespread use. In 2014, Nastya turned 18. She finished her studies and was now looking for a full-time job. Of course, tattooing seemed the most natural direction in which she could succeed. Nastya was talented. She herself was a walking portfolio. By this point, the girl had covered her entire body with designs, even though only 3 years had passed since her first tattoo. One way or another, Anastasia began making a name for herself in the tattoo industry. She was known for her anime-style skin art. The girl was so passionate about this direction that she incorporated it into her image and even engaged in cosplay. Nastya posted photos online, dressed in costumes of various animated characters. Komlovskaya gained fame for several things: her tattoos, her cosplay photos, and selling courses on computer programming and graphic design. Overall, she was a girl with many talents. By the age of 18, Nastya had become an influential figure in social media, a thought leader. At the same time, she was doing what she loved and getting paid for it. By then, Nastya had earned enough to move out of her grandmother's house. Her greatest dream was to become a celebrity, and she was determined to put all her efforts into achieving it. Desiring fame in one way or another, Anastasia always aimed to expand her audience and increase her follower count. To that end, she even auditioned for a Russian TV show called Patsanki, a project about girls with difficult pasts, but she was denied participation in the show, perhaps because she didn't quite fit the parameters required for the program. Nastya wasn't a patsanka in the commonly accepted sense of the word. She was simply an unconventional girl who stood out from the crowd. Although she didn't succeed on television, Anastasia continued to build her reputation in other ways. By the age of 21, she had become a well-known tattoo artist in the area and took on the pseudonym Nastya Grishman. She wanted her name to sound good in English. On social media, she simply wrote her name without vowels. By that time, the only part of her body without tattoos was her back, simply because she couldn't reach it. The girl had done most of the designs herself. By 2019, Nastya was 23. She was a highly recognized artist in her field and was earning a lot of money. At the same time, she began gaining popularity on TikTok. She had about 290,000 followers, and this was before TikTok became hugely popular. While that number might not impress anyone now, back then, Nastya was thrilled. She was at the peak of her popularity and took great pride in it. Unfortunately, it's precisely when things are going great that someone inevitably comes along to ruin it all. And more often than not, it's a man. Dmitry appeared in Nastya's life after his girlfriend, Margarita, with whom he had been dating for 5 years, sent him to a tattoo parlor to her favorite artist. That innocent recommendation soon turned into a catastrophe and ruined the lives of all three. In September 2021, Dmitry came to Nastya Grishman's salon for her to personally do his tattoo. He booked several sessions to get a large design done on his skin. For Nastya, meeting this young man became fateful. Dmitry and Margarita had been a fairly solid couple for 5 years. She was his life partner, business partner, and stage colleague. The thing is, Dmitry had several sources of income, one of which was working as a producer and actor in his own adult films. He came up with plots and costumes for the erotic scenes they filmed. In Russia, this is illegal and even punishable by imprisonment for 2 to 6 years. Watching such films is allowed, but distributing or, worse, producing them is prohibited. So the guy was taking a big risk. Dmitry Chernyshev was born on February 15, 1998, meaning he was 2 years younger than Nastya. Dmitry was from Omsk, from where you could get to St. Petersburg in a few hours, depending on the flight. His mother died when he was very young. His father remarried, and Dmitry was raised by another woman. Due to the tragic shock of losing his mother early, the boy grew up very reserved, quiet, and shy. However, in his teenage years, he became very outgoing. Dmitry spent his childhood and youth in Omsk, where he attended a children's art school. On his social media page, the young man often wrote about his love for poetry, fast food, and reflections on death, sharing various thoughts about things that interested him. His page also featured about a dozen tattoo sketches, mostly images of cars and inscriptions in Japanese. In reality, his posts seemed a bit strange because Dmitry lacked social skills. The guy wrote about how he enjoyed walking through cemeteries and looking at the graves of young girls. For some reason, he described the criteria for choosing his potential partners, even though he was already dating Margarita at the time. The young man said he would never sleep with someone whose weight exceeded a certain limit or who was older than 16. Sometimes Dmitry did mention his girlfriend, but he did so disrespectfully, rudely, and callously. When he turned 18, he and Margarita boarded a plane and moved from Omsk to St. Petersburg. The couple lived in rented apartments. Dmitry took on any odd jobs in web design, programming, and illustration. However, his greatest passion was cars and their restoration. He was registered on dozens of car forums, where he eagerly shared how he became the owner of a Mercedes-Benz in 2020. By the age of 19, he had already received 2 criminal charges. The first was for theft, and the second for evading military service. As a result, he was banned from leaving the country. So, shortly after that, Dmitry ended up in Anastasia's tattoo parlor chair thanks to his girlfriend Margarita, who sent him there. Over the days that Gruesome worked on his tattoos, they talked a lot and realized they had much in common. Both loved cars and art, were good at drawing, and of course, were fans of tattoos. However, Nastya felt that it wasn't just this superficial similarity that connected them, but something deeper. Both young people had been deprived of maternal attention and warmth in childhood. Essentially, they both grew up without a mother. Nastya's mother was alive, but first due to work, and then because of her new family, she was almost never around. Chernyshev and Gruesome understood each other's pain and the constant feeling of loneliness. Both came from troubled families and wanted to achieve something in life on their own. Both were ambitious and dreamed of fame. By the last session at the tattoo parlor, Dmitry and Nastya had grown very close and started going to exhibitions, car showrooms, and tattoo artist conferences together. And soon, as expected, their friendship turned into something more. Dmitry's girlfriend, Margarita, increasingly disliked their close communication. Simply put, she was jealous and constantly caused scenes over it. For Dmitry's sake, the girl had left her hometown of Omsk. She cursed the day she sent her boyfriend to Nastya's tattoo parlor, and now it seemed they were likely starting a romance. Margarita was in despair. She wrote messages to Dmitry, constantly called when he was with Nastya, and threatened to kill herself. One day, after a series of such messages, Anastasia and Dmitry went to the apartment where he lived with his girlfriend to try to convince Margarita that there was nothing more than friendship between him and Nastya, and in fact, there was no romance. Margarita didn't believe a single word. In a fit of emotion, she ran out of the apartment in tears, wearing just her pajamas. It was winter outside, and the girl could catch a cold. But it was likely not just about physical problems. Her mental health was clearly deteriorating too. Margarita needed help, and Nastya was the only one who tried to do something, at least by calling an ambulance. Dmitry kept reassuring Margarita that everything was the same between them. She wanted to believe him, but soon she learned something else that hurt her. Her boyfriend had bought Nastya a car. He had never given her such expensive gifts. Margarita could no longer put up with what was happening. She stole the car and deliberately crashed it. But can you really blame her? The girl was subjected to psychological torture, watching her man clearly have an affair on the side. Worse, he treated his new girlfriend much better than her. Margarita starred in his adult films. Dmitry made money off her and, in the end, repaid her with cruel ingratitude by starting to date the tattoo artist. Soon after the car crash incident, Dmitry broke up with Margarita and officially became a couple with Nastya. It was advantageous for him to be close to a girl who had already gained popularity. Dmitry promised Nastya help with creating content, scheduling posts, and selling her courses. And indeed, when he got involved as a manager, Anastasia's income from work nearly doubled. The guy helped with organization, planning, and managing her schedule, so both benefited from this union. However, Dimitri's flaws outweighed his few advantages. Around February 2022, the young couple began living together as husband and wife. This happened just 5 months after they met. Immediately after that, Nastia's career took a sharp turn. She became Dimitri's new partner in adult films, replacing Margarita. At first, they created content for OnlyFans, and later, they started releasing it on other platforms as well. In the end, Dimitri turned his woman, an influential tattoo artist, into an adult film star. Just a month after starting work on such content, Anastasia was invited to appear on the TV talk show Beyond the Line to talk about her new career in front of the entire country. The show aired in early April 2022. It was a highly controversial program. All the secrets of her common-law husband's past came to light on national television. The episode featuring Gruesome was dedicated to discussing the adult film industry. The show's guests and invited experts asked Nastia various provocative questions. Nastia's mother, Elena, and Dmitry Chernyshev were also present. And so, the show began. The host introduced Nastia Gruesome as a troubled, almost criminal-like girl who had driven her mother to despair with her behavior. The episode started with Elena discussing her daughter with the host and other participants in the discussion. She spoke about how upset she was to learn that Nastia had chosen a career as an adult actress and blamed her common-law husband, Dmitry Chernyshev, for everything. When Nastia appeared in the studio, everyone was already against her, and the girl, fully aware of this, immediately took a defensive stance. She began defending herself and engaging in arguments. She laughed theatrically at the guests' comments, the studio experts, and their lectures about proper living. Nastia truly embraced the role of a TV villain, defiantly claiming that she was the ideal standard of beauty and that posters of her should be everywhere. Nastia knew people had come to express their unflattering opinions about her, so why not play along and build a barrier between the real Nastia and the one everyone perceived her to be? It felt more like a mask worn for self-defense. When attacks began on Nastia's husband for turning her into an adult actress, she declared that she had always dreamed of starring in such films, and Dmitry had merely fulfilled her dream. By that point, the young man had been making adult films with his former partner, Margarita, for 4 years, leading the audience to conclude that all of Chernyshev's girlfriends sooner or later ended up in that industry. However, Nastia spoke as if she was perfectly content with her situation. She mentioned that, thanks to Dmitry, she was earning much more money than before. Then, Margarita, Chernishev's ex-girlfriend, was invited into the studio. Everyone expected drama and confrontations, but it was simply a very heavy spectacle. Margarita was highly emotional and sensitive. Her body betrayed intense anxiety. She was trembling from the moment she appeared in the studio, speaking very quietly and nervously. Against her, Nastia, who laughed and chatted incessantly, looked like the story's villain. When Margarita was asked about Nastia and Dmitry's marriage, she expressed the opinion that it wouldn't last long, since the guy had chosen Gruesome only because of her popularity and social media followers, which he would use for his own interests. Meanwhile, Nastia made it very clear that she didn't believe Margarita because she was simply jealous. Gruesome claimed that her relationship with Dmitry was pure bliss. Right after leaving Margarita, he proposed to her, showered her with gifts, and later surrounded her with care and support. Although Gruesome tried to play the role of a carefree villain, her defensive stance hinted at something much deeper and a lack of self-confidence. This was because she had been neglected for years, ignored in childhood, and wasn't even the priority in her role as a common-law wife. Margarita revealed that Dmitry had not only psychologically, but also physically abused her. For the first time, she publicly stated that she didn't need a man who had once raised a hand against her. Naturally, Nastya rushed to defend Dmitri, calling his ex-girlfriend hysterical and accusing her of attacking. But the audience could see how uncomfortable it was for her to hear all this. The host turned to Nastya's mother and asked if she was scared that her daughter was married to this man. In response, Elena merely brushed it off, saying she knew Dmitri as a quiet, modest, and shy guy. The woman clearly didn't believe Margarita's story. The mother's behavior spoke of her short-sightedness and confirmed her lack of genuine interest in her daughter's fate. When the situation in the studio was already tense, it was Dmitri Chernyshev's turn. He appeared in the studio to further escalate the brewing conflict. In reality, the guy didn't look at all like most people imagined him. He gave the impression of an awkward, meek person, a loser. It looked bizarre when two attractive girls were fighting over this unimpressive young man. However, when Dmitri opened his mouth, the attitude toward him grew even worse. When asked why he left Margarita for Nastya, he replied that the difference was obvious. Wasn't it clear? The fact that he dared to compare the girls in such a way caused disgust because both were attractive in their own way. The guy merely revealed his vile and bitter nature. The host and experts tried to get through to Nastya to open her eyes to her partner, but she never took off her rose-colored glasses. There was an episode where she boasted about expensive gifts from Dmitri: furs, cosmetics, a car, art supplies, not realizing that, in essence, she was paying for everything herself. In April 2022, during the filming of Beyond the Line, life seemed wonderful to Nastya, or at least she insisted it was, that Dmitri loved her, cared for her, that they were making tons of money together. But in reality, there were problems in their paradise. Dmitri quit his main job in IT and began relying solely on Nastya's income. As a result, arguments often arose, and the girl told her mother she was considering leaving her common-law husband. Not just leaving, but moving out of Russia to another country. In less than 2 months, Nastya went from fiercely defending her husband on national television to someone planning to escape from him. She began gradually selling her belongings, saving money, and planning to move to South Korea. Gruesome loved Asian culture. She had several friends in Korea and big plans to open her own tattoo studio there. In another country, Nastya could indeed have become a thriving tattoo artist. But that was only half the reason she planned to leave. It seemed Nastya had met someone new. Rumors had it that a hot, handsome guy had turned her head. It was another TikToker named Kirill Kittleson. They said the two had grown very close. Nastya confided in Kirill because they were definitely friends. Whether there was something more between them is unknown. But they were very close. The girl told Kirill about her problems with Dmitri, how he was draining her, refusing to work, and living off her. Nastya was very angry at Dmitri and couldn't wait to completely cut ties with him and move to South Korea. By the end of July 2022, Dmitri moved out of Nastya's apartment, and they parted ways. On July 31st, Gruesome met with Kirill, and they had a great time. At least that's what the guy thought. However, later that evening, after they parted, Nastya suddenly stunned Kirill with a message saying she didn't want to see him anymore. It was unexpected. The young man thought they got along great, liked each other, and then this strange message came out of nowhere. There were no signs that Nastya wanted to end their connection. The following week, Kirill watched as Nastya calmly continued running her social media. She posted selfies, promoted her courses as usual, and sold her clothes ahead of her move. The guy didn't think much of it. Meanwhile, Nastya's mother and friends felt something was wrong with her. She was still sending them messages, but their content had changed. With each passing day, the girl seemed less and less like her old self. She wasn't filming new videos or taking photos. Everything she posted on social media seemed pre-prepared. Nastya no longer did live streams and stopped answering phone calls. The only way to communicate with her loved ones was through text messages. Suspicions grew, but the truth remained hidden for nearly another week. 3 days later, Dmitri met with friends, including one of Nastya's friends. At this gathering, the guy unexpectedly started sharing some very personal details. Dmitry said that early in his relationship with Gruesome, she had asked him for a favor. If she ever felt so bad that she wanted to die, he should help her leave and spare her suffering. Nastya had been steeped in depression since early childhood, and such a statement didn't seem strange to anyone. But at that moment, it sounded like some kind of devilish pact. According to Dmitry, they had indeed made a verbal agreement, which he had fulfilled a few days ago. The friend, who had known Nastya for a long time, often heard about her constant struggles and disappointments, but she also understood that these were more like cries for help. The friend asked Dmitry what he meant, and he said he had helped Nastya pass to the other side. When the shocked friend started to panic, Chernyshев asked her to calm down and promised to sort everything out. He said he would either turn himself in to the police or follow Nastya. So, Nastya was dead, and Dmitry was the killer. Or had he simply fulfilled his ex-girlfriend's request? What was the real story? While the stunned friend tried to figure out what to do, more and more of Nastya's belongings were being put up for sale online. Dmitry was still free and even applied to extend the lease on Gruesom's apartment, where they had lived together. Apparently, he had no intention of going to the police and was preparing an escape plan. It all looked suspicious and unclear. Nastya's friend didn't understand whether Dmitry was telling the truth or if it was some absurd, foolish joke. The girl was gripped by a mix of fear and doubt, so she hesitated to take action for a long time. Finally, on August 9th, Nastya's friend called the police and told them about Dmitry's confession. She begged the officers to check Gruesom's apartment, still hoping for a miracle. The law enforcement officers who arrived broke down the door since no one answered their knocks. When they entered, they realized there wasn't a single living soul in the house. Dmitry had vanished, and in the bathroom lay the lifeless body of Nastya Kamlovskaya. According to the expert's conclusion, it had been there for at least a week and had already begun to decompose. The cause of death was over 20 stab wounds. Nastya was only 26 years old. She was on the verge of starting a completely new chapter in her life. But someone had taken her future away. The main suspect, of course, was Dmitry Chernyshев. He was found within 24 hours and arrested. It turned out the guy was hiding in a nearby motel. When the family and friends were informed of the tragic news about Nastya, everything fell into place. That horrible gut feeling that had tormented them all week proved prophetic. Her loved ones realized why the girl had been acting so strangely lately. It simply wasn't Nastya. All the text messages, online sales, and uploaded content were done by Dmitry, pretending to be the girl he had recently killed. So, what happened to Nastya Gruesome? The police managed to reconstruct the events of that night when she died based on forensic findings and evidence. On July 31st, the evening Nastya met with Kirill, the TikTok guy, everything was great. But later that night, Dmitry Chernyshев came to her apartment. From the belongings scattered around, clothes for sale, and packed suitcases and boxes, the guy realized Nastya was planning to go somewhere. His ex-girlfriend was seriously planning to leave Russia, and it was going to happen soon. For him, this was a definitive, irreversible end to their relationship. Most likely, that's when Dmitry found out about Kirill. Later, Chernyshев himself told the police about the events of that evening. It resembled a fit of jealousy when a man loses control over his woman and, in a frenzy, tries to win her back. He confessed to the officers that he and Nastya had a big fight. He lost his temper, completely lost his mind, stabbed her several times with a knife, panicked, and then fled. However, that same day, Dmitry changed his story, repeating what he had told his friends at the gathering. Nastya wanted to end her life and asked him for help. He was only fulfilling her request. Chernyshev's friends supported his position. One of his friends wrote a post on social media saying that Dmitry had taken Nastya's life and confessed to it, but in reality, It was much more complicated. It wasn't a fight or a schizophrenic episode. It happened because Nastya wanted to die. She couldn't bear her life, but couldn't end it herself. Dmitry agreed to do it only on the third try, giving in to Grishman's pleas. The news of Nastya's tragic death became a major story on social media. After all, the girl had about 300,000 followers who followed her life. The disappearance of a TikToker couldn't go unnoticed. Dmitry tried his best to maintain his privacy, asking the authorities not to show his face to the press. But you can't hide the truth. Everyone had seen him, clothed and unclothed, so it was foolish to hide after what he had done. Chernishev was taken to Nastya's apartment, the crime scene, to reenact for the police what he claimed had happened that night. There are still videos online where he recounts and demonstrates the chronology of the attack on his common-law wife. At that moment, he was in handcuffs, showing on a mannequin how he stabbed her. It was truly a heavy sight, because in reality, it wasn't a mannequin. It was Nastya, a living girl, bleeding out on the bed. On January 22, 2023, Dmitry pleaded guilty to the murder of Nastya Komlovskaya. He said that after stabbing her several times, the girl died in his arms. Then he carried her to the bathroom and left her body there. Chernishev deliberately delayed, responding to messages from friends and family from Nastya's phone, pretending she was still alive. It's believed that Dmitry attacked Anastasia out of jealousy. It's unclear exactly what triggered the fit of rage. Was it because he learned about her relationship with Kirill, or her plans to move abroad, or simply because she was no longer financially dependent on him and he lost control over her? But those were the most obvious reasons. The investigation lasted about a year. It concluded in the summer of 2023, and the case was sent to court. In January 2024, Dmitry was sentenced. He was given only 8 years in prison to be served in a maximum security colony. That was the ending of this Russian true crime story. Nastya Komlovskaya's sister gave a brief interview to the press, refuting information from friends who claimed Grishman had asked to be killed. The sister believed some acquaintances were simply trying to gain attention from her sister's tragedy. Other relatives couldn't say much about the deceased's life, since they had barely communicated with her recently. Anastasia was buried privately, but her mother allowed film crews to attend and make a report for a fee. Elena was paid so that fans could see their idol's funeral. Many found it strange. How could someone make money off their family's tragedy? All of Nastya's loved ones attended the funeral, even her father, with whom she had never communicated. Elena's mother-in-law, who had raised Nastya for several years, stood apart. She also disliked the idea of inviting film crews to the farewell. But the coverage of Nastya Grishman's life and death didn't end there. The TV talk show Beyond the Line, in which the girl had participated with her mother, Dmitry and Margarita, filmed a second part after Nastya's death. They invited Anastasia's friend, who had called the police, along with Elena, Grishman's mother, and a few other people. Everyone was paid for participating in the show, just like the first time. Elena, dressed in all black, recalled how she corresponded with her daughter, even though she was no longer alive. Dmitry was the one responding to her instead of Anastasia. The woman sensed something was wrong, but she only fully realized it when the police told her the bitter truth. Then Nastya's friend came out to the studio, and she faced a barrage of criticism for waiting so long before calling the police. It took her a whole week, and the girl felt deeply guilty about it. On the show, she revealed new information to the audience about the day of Anastasia's death. According to Dmitry, the last thing Grishman said was a request to call an ambulance, and that request contradicted his claim that Nastya wanted to end her life. If she really wanted to die, why would she need an ambulance? And why, in that case, didn't the young man try to save his wife? Many people didn't believe Nastya could have said anything at that moment, as most of the stab wounds were to her throat. Nastya's friend also shared how Dmitry covered his tracks. He taped up all the pipes and ventilation ducts in the apartment to prevent the smell of the decomposing body from attracting the neighbors' attention. Dmitri sprayed Nastya's perfume everywhere in a desperate attempt to mask the stench of the dead body. How long was he planning to keep her rotting corpse in the apartment? It seems he had no intention of removing the body, as he applied to extend the lease on the apartment. After Nastya's death, photos from her adult channel surfaced online, and news articles included screenshots of her correspondence. The spread of her personal content was fueled not only by ordinary users, but also by journalists. Comments on these articles remain controversial to this day. Some people pray for Nastya Grishman's soul to find peace. Others don't understand why the death of an adult actress deserves press coverage at all. But no matter how unconventional a person Nastya was, she was, above all, a young woman, a human being with her own dreams and plans for life. After her death, all of Grishman's social media accounts were deleted. Only fan pages remain active, still posting content in memory of this extraordinary girl. Nastya Komlovskaya was a bright, bold, 26-year-old young woman. She didn't just create art, she was a part of it herself. It's good that people remember her that way. If you have finished watching, you are a real fan of true crime. Subscribe to the channel, turn on the bell notifications, and put the like. See you in the next video.